Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the old maps still have edges and the stories that live beyond those edges are worth following slowly, carefully, all the way to the end. Imagine standing at the shore of the Indian Ocean on a calm night. Not a modern shore with lights and roads and the sound of engines somewhere in the distance. An older shore, a quieter one, where the only sounds are the water moving against the sand and the wind coming in off the open sea. The ocean stretches before you in every direction until it becomes indistinguishable from the sky. The stars are very bright here. They have always been bright over this water. Sailors learned to read them long before anyone thought to write down what they saw. The trade winds move across the surface with a kind of rhythm that feels almost deliberate, almost patient, as if the ocean itself has been waiting for someone to understand it. For most of human history, the Indian Ocean was not a mystery. Not to the people who lived beside it and sailed across it. Arab traders had been reading its monsoon winds for over 1,000 years, crossing from the coast of East Africa to the shores of India, and back again with the seasons, carrying spices, cloth, porcelain, gold and ivory and wooden dhows that knew these waters the way a shepherd knows a hillside. Indian merchants had done the same. Chinese fleets had sailed here in enormous ships during the early 1400s, enormous enough that the European vessels that would come later would have looked almost modest in comparison. The Swahili city-states along the eastern coast of Africa were wealthy, sophisticated, and deeply connected to this trade. There were harbours here, warehouses, mosques, counting houses, and families who had been in the business of ocean commerce for generations. The Indian Ocean was, in many ways, the centre of the world's trade for centuries. It just happened to be a centre that Europeans had never reached. Not by sea anyway, not from the west, not around the bottom of Africa, which for a very long time no European sailor knew had a bottom at all. Tonight, we are following the story of the first European ships to sail from Europe all the way to India by sea. It is a story that begins with maps that end in blank space, with a small country on the edge of the Atlantic that looked outward for a very long time before it finally got there, and with a man named Vasco da Gama, who in the year 1497 took 4 ships south from Lisbon and kept going until the world changed. It is a story about wind and navigation and endurance and remarkable courage. But it is also a story about what was already there when those ships arrived and what happened to that world afterward. And that part of the story is worth telling just as carefully. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere warm, with the window cracked and the sound of the neighbourhood settling into quiet? Or somewhere cold, tucked under something soft, watching the dark through the glass? Maybe it is late where you are, and the house has gone still, and you have this hour to yourself. Or maybe it is early, and the day has not yet started, and you are letting this story ease you gently into the morning. Whatever the answer is, I am glad you are here. This is the kind of story that deserves a little quiet around it. It has been waiting about 500 years, so there is no need to rush. If you enjoy the kind of slow, careful storytelling we do here on Life Beyond Seen, it would mean a great deal if you gave this video a like, or subscribed if you have not already. It genuinely helps this channel reach other people who might be looking for something calm to listen to at the end of a long day. Thank you for that. Now, let us go back to the water. The year 1497 is the anchor point of this story, but the story itself begins much earlier and much farther inland. It begins in the markets of Europe, where certain small dried objects carried prices that seem almost absurd to us now. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg. These were not merely flavours, they were wealth in portable form. They preserved meat in an age before refrigeration. They masked the taste of food that had been kept too long. They were used in medicine, in perfume, in religious ceremonies, in the kitchens of the powerful and the aspirations of everyone else. A merchant who could control the supply of spices could become very rich indeed. And for most of the medieval period, the spices that reached European tables had travelled an extraordinary distance overland through the Middle East and Central Asia, passing through many hands each one taking a portion of the value, before arriving in the ports of Venice or Genoa at prices that reflected every mile and every middleman. Then, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople. The old overland routes through the eastern Mediterranean became even more complicated and expensive for European merchants. The question that had been simmering for decades became urgent. Was there another way? Could a ship sail south from Europe, around Africa if Africa had a southern end, and reach India directly? Could the middlemen be cut out entirely? This was the question that Portugal decided to answer, and Portugal, sitting on the southwestern edge of Europe with its face turned toward the Atlantic, was well positioned to try. I want to pause here for just a moment, because it is worth appreciating what kind of question this actually was in the late 1400s. The southern tip of Africa, if it existed, was completely unknown to European cartographers. Maps of the period showed Africa stretching downward and then simply stopping, with a note that amounted to, "We do not know." The Indian Ocean was sometimes depicted as an enclosed sea, landlocked, unreachable from the Atlantic. The idea that a ship could sail from Lisbon, go south, turn a corner at the bottom of a continent, and emerge into a completely different ocean on the other side of the world, that was not a plan. It was a hope. A carefully considered, systematically pursued hope, but a hope nonetheless. What makes Portugal's approach unusual is how methodical it was. This was not one bold captain deciding on a whim to sail into the unknown. It was a decades-long national project, built incrementally, one expedition at a time, pushing a little further south with each voyage, learning from each failure and each partial success. The man most associated with the beginning of this project is Prince Henry, known to history as Henry the Navigator, though he himself rarely sailed. He gathered navigators, cartographers, and sailors at a school of sorts in southern Portugal, and directed the systematic exploration of the African coastline beginning around 1419. The expeditions crept southward year by year. The Canary Islands, the coast of West Africa, the terrifying and long-avoided Cape Boiador, which sailors believed marked the edge of the navigable world, was finally rounded by a Portuguese captain named Gil Eanes in 1434. The equator was crossed. The Congo River was reached. Each milestone was a piece of information, a small increment in the map, a reduction in the blank space. By the time Vasco da Gama was preparing to sail in 1497, Portugal had been working toward this moment for the better part of 80 years. The voyage was not an act of sudden inspiration. It was the culmination of a very long, very patient project, and the man who had come closest to the destination before da Gama was a navigator named Bartolomeu Dias, who in 1488 had rounded the southernmost tip of Africa and briefly entered the Indian Ocean before his crew refused to go further and forced him to turn back. Dias named that cape the Cape of Storms. King John II of Portugal, perhaps in a spirit of optimism or perhaps in a spirit of practical marketing, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, because it proved something enormous. Africa had a bottom, the Indian Ocean was reachable, the door was open, and then, for 9 years, Portugal did not walk through it. There were reasons for this, which we will look at more closely as the story unfolds. But by 1497, the moment had arrived. A new king, Manuel I, sat on the Portuguese throne. The preparations were complete, the ships were ready, and Vasco da Gama had been chosen to lead the expedition. Da Gama is a fascinating figure, partly because so much about him is uncertain. He was born sometime in the 1460s, most likely around 1469, in a small coastal town called Sines in southern Portugal. His father was a minor nobleman with connections to the Portuguese court, and Vasco grew up in a world where the sea was not abstract. Sines sits directly on the Atlantic coast. The water was always there, always visible, always part of the context of daily life. He had naval and military experience by the time he was selected for the India voyage, and he had apparently carried out at least one diplomatic mission for the crown. But he was not the most experienced sailor in Portugal. He was not the most obvious choice. Bartolomeu Dias, the man who had already rounded the Cape was still alive and available. Why King Manuel chose da Gama over Dias, or over other more seasoned candidates, is a question historians have debated without reaching a firm answer. One possibility is that the mission required someone who could act as a diplomat and an authority figure as much as a navigator, someone with the bearing and the confidence to represent the Portuguese crown in the courts of foreign rulers. Whatever the reason, da Gama was the choice, and the choice would define the rest of his life, and in some ways, the rest of the century. The fleet assembled for the voyage consisted of 4 vessels: the São Gabriel, which da Gama commanded himself; the São Rafael, commanded by his brother Paulo da Gama; a smaller caravel called the Berrio, under the command of Nicolau Coelho; and a 4th, unnamed supply ship carrying provisions for the long journey. The total crew numbered somewhere around 170 men, though the exact figure varies depending on the source. Among them were pilots, soldiers, priests, interpreters, and convicts, men condemned to death whose sentences had been commuted on the condition that they would be sent ashore in unfamiliar lands to gather information, men who were considered expendable in a way that the rest of the crew was not. The ships carried special stone pillars called padrões, carved with the Portuguese royal coat of arms, which were to be planted at significant points along the route as markers of Portuguese discovery and claim. They also carried trade goods intended for the markets of India, though as we will see, those goods would turn out to be considerably less impressive than the Portuguese had hoped. The departure was set for July 1497. The preparations were complete, the prayers had been said. The ship sat in the harbour at Restilo, just outside Lisbon, waiting for the tide and the wind to align. And somewhere in the city, Vasco da Gama was preparing to step onto a ship and sail toward a destination that no European vessel had ever reached, across waters that no European had ever charted, into a world that Europe did not yet know how to imagine. What made this voyage matter so deeply, not just to Portugal but eventually to the entire world, goes beyond the ambition of one king or the courage of one fleet. The route da Gama was attempting, if it worked, would fundamentally reshape the flow of global trade. It would shift power from the cities of the eastern Mediterranean to the ports of the Atlantic coast. It would give one small nation on the edge of Europe direct access to the richest trade routes in the world, bypassing every middleman between Lisbon and Calicut. The implications of that, economic, political, cultural, and ultimately violent, would take decades to fully unfold. But they all began with those 4 ships, those 170 men, and the long southern horizon waiting ahead of them, and that is where we begin. Not with the arrival, not with the triumph, but with the departure. With the moment when the ropes were cast off, the sails filled with wind, and the coast of Portugal began to grow smaller behind them. Because the story of how Europe first reached India by sea is not really a story about a destination. It is a story about everything that happened on the way there, and everything that happened after. To understand why those 4 ships mattered so much, you have to go back a little further. Not to 1497, but to the world that made 1497 feel necessary. Because the voyage of Vasco da Gama did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a very specific kind of hunger, the kind that is not about food at all, but about the things that made food worth eating, and that made wealthy men feel wealthy, and that made the distance between Europe and Asia feel like both a problem and a promise. In 15th century Europe, spices were extraordinary things, not in the way we might casually reach for pepper at a dinner table tonight without thinking twice about it. In that era, spices were closer to what we might think of as luxury goods and medicine and currency, all compressed into small, fragrant, almost impossibly travelled objects. Pepper, which came primarily from the Malabar coast of southwestern India, was so valuable that it was sometimes used to pay rent, settle debts, and even ransom prisoners. Cinnamon came from Ceylon, the island we now call Sri Lanka. Cloves came from a small cluster of islands in what is now eastern Indonesia. a place so remote that most Europeans in 1400 could not have pointed to it on a map, partly because no European map showed it accurately. Nutmeg came from the same general region. These were not ingredients, they were objects of genuine economic power. Part of their value was practical. Spices helped preserve food, or at least that is the traditional explanation, though historians have debated how much of that is accurate versus how much Europeans simply wanted to believe it justified the expense. What is clearer is that spices made food taste better in a time when the European diet was not exactly celebrated for its variety, and that they carried a kind of prestige. Having pepper on your table meant something about who you were. Having cloves or nutmeg meant you had access to something most people did not. And because they travelled so far to reach a European kitchen, they carried with them the glamour of distance, the sense that they came from somewhere warm and extraordinary and almost mythological. The problem, by the mid-1400s, was getting them. The spice trade between Asia and Europe had for centuries flowed along a complex web of overland and coastal routes that we loosely call the Silk Road, though that name covers many different paths and many different intermediaries. Goods moved from the Spice Islands through the ports of India, across the Arabian Sea to the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, overland through the Middle East, and eventually into the markets of the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly Venice and Genoa, which had built their considerable wealth partly on controlling the European end of this system. By the time a bag of pepper reached a Venetian merchant, it had passed through the hands of Indian traders, Arab merchants, Persian middlemen, and several layers of taxation and markup. The final price in Europe reflected all of that. Then came 1453. That year, the Ottoman Turks under Sultan Mehmed II captured Constantinople, the great city at the crossroads of Europe and Asia that had served as the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. The fall of Constantinople was a seismic event in many ways, politically and culturally, but its effect on European trade was also profound. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the key land routes between the Mediterranean and the East. This did not mean that trade stopped entirely. The Ottomans were not opposed to commerce, and spices continued to move, but the terms shifted, tariffs and duties increased. The reliability of the overland routes became less certain. European merchants found themselves at the mercy of a political power that had no particular reason to make their lives easier. The cost of spices in Europe rose. The anxiety about supply rose with it. Portugal, sitting on the far southwestern edge of Europe, had a particular relationship with this problem. Geographically, it was about as far from Constantinople as you could get while still being in Europe. It had no meaningful access to the Eastern Mediterranean trade networks that Venice and Genoa dominated. It was, in a sense, already facing the Atlantic before anyone had decided to take the Atlantic seriously. And that position, which might have seemed like a disadvantage, turned out to be a kind of accidental preparation. The Portuguese had been pushing out into the Atlantic and down the African coast for decades before da Gama was even born. Much of this early effort is associated with a figure known to history as Prince Henry the Navigator, which is a title that came later and perhaps overstates his personal involvement in actual navigation, since Henry himself rarely sailed. But as a patron and organiser of exploration, his influence was real. Henry was a son of King John I of Portugal, born in 1394, and from around 1419 onward, he gathered pilots, cartographers, and sailors at his court in the Algarve, the southernmost region of Portugal, and directed a systematic effort to explore the African coast. His motivations were a mixture of commercial ambition, religious crusading instinct, and genuine curiosity about what lay beyond the known world. The early progress was slow. The Canary Islands were known, though contested, with Castile. Madeira was settled by the Portuguese around 1420. The Azores, further out in the Atlantic, were reached in the 1430s. But the real psychological barrier was Cape Bojador, a promontory on the West African coast south of the Canary Islands. Cape Bojador had a fearsome reputation. Sailors believed that beyond it the sea became unnavigable, that the currents were too strong, that the water boiled, that ships would be destroyed and men would not return. Whether these fears were entirely imagined or based on some genuine navigational difficulty, the effect was real. For years, expedition after expedition turned back at Boiador. Henry reportedly sent out 15 expeditions before one finally succeeded. In 1434, a Portuguese captain named Gil Eanes sailed past the Cape and returned safely. It sounds simple, it was not. The psychological weight of crossing that line, of sailing past the edge of what sailors believed was possible, was enormous. After Boiador, the African coast opened up. Over the following decades, Portuguese ships crept steadily southward. They crossed the equator, which had its own mythological weight in European imagination, the idea that the equatorial regions were too hot for human survival. They found that the world did not end there, that the sea did not boil, that men did not catch fire. They reached the mouth of the Congo River in 1482. They encountered coastlines, peoples and climates that didn't match anything in their charts or their classical texts. Each expedition pushed a little further, planted a stone pillar, and returned with information that made the next expedition slightly less uncertain. The cumulative effect of all this was an extraordinary body of knowledge about the African coast, built over roughly 60 years of careful incremental exploration. By the time Bartolomeu Dias set out in 1487, the Portuguese knew the African coast well enough to have a reasonable expectation that it had an end. What they did not know was how far south that end was, or what lay beyond it. Dias found out. His fleet of 3 small ships left Lisbon in August 1487 and pushed further south than any European had gone before. In January 1488, they were driven by storms far out to sea and south of the African continent, and when Dias turned east and then north, he found himself in waters that no European ship had ever entered. He had rounded the Cape without quite seeing it, swept past it in the storm. He continued up the eastern coast of what is now South Africa, reaching a point he called the Rio do Infante, before his crew, exhausted and frightened and far from home, refused to go further. Dias turned back. On the return journey he saw the Cape for the first time from the sea, the great rocky headland at the tip of Africa, and understood what it was. He called it the Cape of Storms. As mentioned earlier, the king renamed it. The name change was not just poetry, it was a statement of intent. Dias returned to Lisbon in December 1488 with proof of something that changed the entire calculation. Africa had a southern tip, and beyond that tip lay open water connecting to the Indian Ocean. The route to India by sea was not a fantasy. It was a geography problem with a solution. And yet, as the story has already noted, Portugal then waited 9 years before sending another fleet. This pause is worth lingering on for a moment, because it is one of the more interesting silences in the history of exploration. Some of the delay was simply practical. King John II, who had sponsored Dias's voyage, died in 1495 and was succeeded by Manuel I. There were political complications, diplomatic negotiations with Spain, and the enormous logistical challenge of planning a voyage far larger and more ambitious than anything Dias had attempted. Dias had gone to the Cape and come back. Da Gama was being sent to India, which meant a much longer voyage, much larger ships, much more supplies, and a mission that was as much diplomatic and commercial as it was navigational. Preparing for that took time. There is also the possibility that Portugal was gathering intelligence in the meantime, trying to learn more about what lay on the other side of the Cape before committing to the full expedition. Some historians have suggested that overland agents were sent toward India during this period to gather information, though the evidence is fragmentary. Whatever the reasons, by 1497 the waiting was over. The ships were built and provisioned, the pilots were chosen, the stone pillars were carved, and the spice trade, that ancient, complicated, enormously profitable river of goods flowing from the warm coasts of Asia to the tables of European merchants and nobles, was about to be disrupted in a way that nobody in Venice or Cairo or Constantinople could quite see coming yet. It is worth pausing on that for just a moment, because the scale of what was at stake is easy to underestimate from this distance. The spice trade was not a minor commercial activity. It was one of the central economic engines of the medieval and early modern world. The wealth of Venice, one of the most powerful city-states in Europe for several centuries, rested substantially on its position as the western terminus of that trade. The Arab merchants who carried goods across the Indian Ocean and up through the Red Sea and Persian Gulf had built prosperous, sophisticated trading cultures over generations. The rulers of the Swahili coast cities in East Africa, the sultans of the Malabar ports in India, the merchants of Hormuz and Aden, all of them were participants in a system that had been functioning, evolving, and generating wealth for centuries before any Portuguese ship appeared on the horizon. Into this world, Vasco da Gama was about to sail. Not as a peaceful visitor, not as a curious traveller, but as the representative of a crown that wanted to break into the system, to cut out the middlemen, to establish direct access to the sources of the spice trade and redirect the profits toward Lisbon. The ambition was clear, the method was still being worked out, and the world that da Gama was sailing toward had its own power, its own logic, and its own response waiting for him. But first, he had to get there, and getting there meant sailing south along the coast of Africa, rounding the Cape that had already broken one crew's nerve, and then crossing an ocean that no European navigator had ever attempted. The knowledge of how to do that, the winds and the currents and the timing, was not something the Portuguese possessed yet. It would have to be learned, partly by experience, partly by asking the right people once they arrived on the other side of the continent. The story of how they got from Lisbon to the Cape, and what happened in the storms and the silences of that long southern passage, is where the voyage truly begins to take shape. To understand how Portugal arrived at that moment of readiness in 1497, it helps to go back further, much further, to the early decades of the 15th century, when the idea of sailing down the African coast was itself a radical and uncertain proposition. The Portuguese did not simply decide one morning to find a sea route to India. They stumbled toward it slowly, over the course of nearly 80 years, one expedition at a time, each voyage extending a little further than the last, each captain carrying back a little more knowledge of what lay ahead. The beginning, in a formal sense, was the capture of Ceuta in 1415. Ceuta was a wealthy Muslim trading city on the northern coast of Africa, just across the strait from the Iberian Peninsula, and Portugal took it by force under King John I. The military campaign was partly about prestige, partly about disrupting the gold and spice trade that passed through North Africa, and partly about the ambitions of a young prince named Henry, who would later become known to history as Henry the Navigator. Henry was present at Ceuta, and something about what he saw there, the goods, the traders, the routes that converged at that city from deep in the African interior, seems to have sharpened a curiosity that never really left him. He spent the rest of his life, until his death in 1460, organising and funding expeditions down the Atlantic coast of Africa, not sailing himself, despite the name history gave him, but directing, financing and accumulating the knowledge that each returning captain brought back. The early voyages were cautious. The Canary Islands were visited. The coast of Morocco was mapped more carefully. But there was a particular barrier that stopped European sailors for years, a headland on the Moroccan coast called Cape Bojador. It sounds unremarkable on a modern map, just a slight westward bulge of the African coastline at roughly 26 degrees north. But to 15th century sailors, it was the edge of the known world in a very practical sense. The currents there ran strongly northward, making it difficult to return. The shallow waters were treacherous. Strange reddish fog sometimes sat on the water. Stories circulated, as they always do when sailors are afraid, about sea monsters, boiling water, and currents that would drag a ship into an abyss from which no one came back. For years nobody sailed past it. Then, in 1434, a Portuguese captain named Gil Eanes did. He rounded Cape Bojador, found nothing monstrous on the other side, and returned to report that the sea was navigable. It seems almost anticlimactic from this distance, but at the time it was a genuine psychological breakthrough. If Cape Bojador was not a wall, then perhaps the rest of the coast was not either. The expeditions continued. Each year, or nearly each year, a ship went further south and returned with new information. The coast of West Africa was mapped in segments. The equator was crossed, which sailors had feared might bring some catastrophic change in the sea or sky. It did not. The Congo River was reached around 1482, an enormous mouth of brown water pouring into the Atlantic, proof that the African continent was vast beyond what anyone in Europe had properly imagined. Through all of this, the underlying question remained the same. Did Africa end? Was there a southern tip? And if so, was there open water beyond it connecting to the Indian Ocean? Arab geographers had suggested for centuries that Africa was circumnavigable, but European knowledge of the continent's shape was still fragmentary and speculative. Some maps of the period showed Africa tapering to a point in the south. Others showed it extending indefinitely, merging with a hypothetical southern continent. Nobody knew for certain. Bartolomeu Dias was the man who found out. He left Lisbon in August 1487 with 3 ships, and what he accomplished over the following months was one of the most consequential pieces of navigation in history. The fleet moved steadily south along the African coast, past points that previous expeditions had reached, into waters that were genuinely unmapped. As they pushed further south, the weather grew rougher and the seas heavier. In early January 1488, a powerful storm caught the fleet and drove it south for several days, out of sight of land, into the cold and turbulent waters of the South Atlantic. When the storm finally eased, Dias turned east, expecting to find the African coast again. He found nothing. He turned north, and after some days land appeared, but it was land on his left side, not his right. He was already past the southern tip of Africa without having seen it. The continent had ended somewhere behind him in the storm. He continued up what is now the southeastern coast of South Africa, reaching a point he named the Rio do Infante, near the present-day Kei River. He wanted to go further. His crew did not. They had been at sea for months, they were exhausted, and they were a very long way from home. The officers were consulted, as was the custom, and the vote was to turn back. Dias, by all accounts, was deeply reluctant. He marked the furthest point reached with a stone pillar, one of the Padrao markers the Portuguese used to claim territory, and then he turned the ships around. On the return journey, sailing back south and then west, he saw the Cape for the first time, the great rocky headland at the southwestern tip of Africa, jutting out into the sea where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet. He had passed it in the storm without seeing it. Now, from the deck of his ship, he could look at it directly. He named it the Cape of Storms, which was honest and accurate given what he had just experienced. King John II, when Dias returned to Lisbon in December 1488, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. The king's reasoning was straightforward. A Cape of Storms was something to fear. A Cape of Good Hope was something to sail toward. The name was a piece of royal optimism, but it was also a signal to the court, to the merchants, to the pilots, and to anyone else paying attention. The door was open. The Indian Ocean was reachable. The question was no longer whether the route existed, but when Portugal would send a fleet to follow it all the way through. The answer, as it turned out, was not immediately. 9 years passed between Dias's return and da Gama's departure. This gap has puzzled historians, and there is no single clean explanation for it. Part of it was the death of King John II in 1495 and the transition to his successor, Manuel I, who needed time to consolidate his position and assess the priorities he had inherited. Part of it was the enormous practical challenge of preparing for a voyage far more ambitious than anything Dias had attempted. Dias had sailed to the Cape and back, a remarkable achievement, but still fundamentally an exploratory mission along a coastline. Da Gama was being sent to India, which meant crossing an ocean no Portuguese navigator had ever crossed, arriving at a sophisticated foreign civilization and attempting to establish commercial and diplomatic relations on behalf of the Portuguese crown. That required ships built specifically for the mission, supplies for a voyage that might last 2 years, and a carefully chosen crew. There is also a possibility, suggested by some historians, that Portugal spent part of those 9 years gathering intelligence. The spy and diplomat Pero da Covilhã had been sent overland toward India in 1487, the same year Dias departed, and he reached the Malabar coast of India and the East African ports before eventually ending up in Ethiopia, where he stayed for the rest of his life and never returned to Portugal. Whether any of the information he gathered made its way back to Lisbon in time to help plan da Gama's voyage is uncertain. Some accounts suggest that reports did reach Portugal, though the details are murky. What seems clear is that by the mid-1490s, the Portuguese court had a reasonable understanding that the Indian Ocean was a world of active, sophisticated trade, that Muslim merchants dominated much of it, and that arriving there as a small fleet of unknown ships would require careful handling. Bartolomeu Dias himself was involved in the preparations for da Gama's voyage. He helped supervise the construction of the fleet, drawing on his own experience of the southern seas to advise on the design and provisioning of the ships. There is something quietly poignant about that detail. Dias had been the one to open the door, to prove that the route was possible, to endure the storms and the crew's fear and the long, difficult return. And yet it was not he who was chosen to walk through that door. He accompanied da Gama's fleet as far as the Cape Verde Islands, then turned aside to oversee a separate expedition to West Africa. He would eventually round the Cape again in 1500 as part of Pedro Alvarez Cabral's fleet, and he would die in a storm near that same cape, the place that had defined his life's work. But that is a story for later. The fleet that Dias helped prepare consisted of 4 ships. The São Gabriel was the flagship, a vessel of around 178 tons, heavily built and armed. The São Rafael was commanded by da Gama's brother Paulo, a similar size. The Berrio was smaller and faster, a caravel of around 50 tons, and then there was a 4th ship, an unnamed supply vessel, carrying extra provisions, equipment, and trade goods. The total number of men who sailed is usually given as around 170, though different sources offer slightly different figures. They were sailors, soldiers, interpreters, convicts, priests, and pilots. Among them were men who had sailed with Dias, men who knew the West African coast, and men who had never been further from Lisbon than the mouth of the Tagus. The stone pillars, the padrões, were an important detail. These were carved limestone columns, each bearing the Portuguese royal arms, a cross and an inscription. They were planted at significant points along new coasts to mark Portuguese discovery and claim. Da Gama's fleet carried several of them. They were heavy, deliberate objects, not improvised markers, but carefully prepared statements of intent. Planting one on a foreign shore was an act that meant something specific in the diplomatic and legal language of 15th century European expansion. It said, in effect, "We were here, we claim this, and we expect that claim to be recognised." Whether the people living on those shores agreed with that claim was, from the Portuguese perspective, a secondary concern. By the spring of 1497, the ships were loaded and the crews were assembled. The supplies included salted beef, dried fish, biscuit, oil, vinegar, rice, lentils, and wine. There were weapons, trade goods, navigational instruments, and the padrões. There were also letters of introduction from the Portuguese king, written in Arabic, intended for the Muslim rulers and merchants da Gama expected to encounter on the East African coast and in India. The fleet was ready for a voyage that might take anywhere from 1 to 3 years, depending on conditions. Nobody knew exactly how long it would take, because nobody had done it before. The pilots had charts of the African coast as far as the Cape, and they had whatever knowledge they could gather about the Indian Ocean from Arab sources and from the fragmentary reports that had filtered back through overland travellers. Beyond that, they would have to learn as they went. The city of Lisbon in the summer of 1497 was a place of considerable excitement and anxiety about this departure. Portugal was a small country, roughly the size of Indiana, with a population of perhaps 1 million people. It had been punching far above its weight in exploration for decades, and this voyage represented the largest and most consequential bet yet. If it succeeded, the rewards would be staggering. If it failed, the investment was lost and the dream of direct access to the spice trade would have to be set aside, perhaps permanently. The men boarding those 4 ships understood, at least in general terms, what was at stake. Some of them had families watching from the shore. Some had made their wills before departing, which was common practice before long voyages, a practical acknowledgement that the sea did not make promises. And so, with the ships provisioned and the pilots ready, and the stone pillars stowed in the hold, the moment of departure approached. The 9 years of waiting, the decades of incremental exploration that had preceded them, the storms that Dias had survived, the slow accumulation of knowledge about currents and winds and the shape of the African continent, all of it had been building toward this. The door that Dias had opened was still standing open. Someone just had to be willing to walk through it and keep going, past the Cape, into the Indian Ocean, all the way to the coast of India. That someone, for reasons that were not entirely obvious at the time, and remain somewhat debated by historians today, was Vasco da Gama. So who was he exactly? That is a fair question, and the honest answer is that we know less about Vasco da Gama's early life than you might expect, given how famous the voyage made him. History has a way of doing that. It preserves the achievement in great detail, while letting the person behind it stay partially in shadow. We know the broad outlines. We know the family, the town, the general trajectory. But the inner life, the particular qualities that made one man stand out from the other, experienced captains available to the Portuguese crown in 1497, that is harder to pin down with confidence. He was born around 1460, though some historians place the date a few years earlier or later. The records from that period are not precise enough to be certain. His birthplace was Sines, a small coastal town in the Alentejo region of southern Portugal, sitting right on the Atlantic. It is still a small town today, with a harbour and a castle, and a statue of da Gama looking out toward the water. In the 15th century it was a modest fishing and trading port, not a grand city, not a place of great wealth or influence. But it was on the sea, and that mattered. Growing up in Sines meant growing up with ships and tides and sailors, with the smell of salt and the sound of rigging, with a practical understanding of the ocean as something you worked with rather than simply admired from a distance. His father, Esteban da Gama, was the civil governor of Sines, a minor noble position that gave the family a certain standing without placing them among the great aristocratic houses of Portugal. The da Gamas were respectable but not powerful, connected to the court but not at its centre. This background had practical consequences for Vasco. He received an education that included mathematics and navigation, likely studied Evora, and he developed the kind of technical competence that the Portuguese crown valued in its naval officers. He was not a gentleman who sailed for adventure. He was a trained navigator and military man who understood the sea as a professional. His naval career before the 1497 voyage is somewhat difficult to reconstruct in detail. What the records do show is that he had military experience along the Portuguese coast, and possibly in West Africa, and that he was known to King Joan II before that king's death in 1495. There is one specific incident that historians sometimes point to as evidence of his character. In the early 1490s, da Gama was sent to seize French ships in Portuguese ports, in retaliation for French raids on Portuguese vessels. He apparently carried out this mission quickly and effectively, without waiting for lengthy diplomatic negotiations. That kind of decisive, forceful action seems to have made an impression. It suggested a man who could be relied upon to get things done, even in difficult or politically sensitive circumstances, without losing his nerve. King Manuel I, who came to the throne in 1495 after Jerome II's death, inherited the project of the India voyage along with the crown. Jerome II had been deeply invested in the idea and had done much of the preparatory work. Manuel, younger and perhaps more cautious in some respects, nonetheless decided to push forward, and he chose Vasco da Gama to lead the expedition. The choice was not universally obvious at the time, and historians have puzzled over it since. Bartolomeo Dias was the most experienced candidate in terms of Southern Ocean sailing. He had actually been to the Cape of Good Hope. He knew the conditions, the storms, the currents. He had the credentials that the mission seemed to demand. Why he was passed over is not entirely clear. One explanation that some scholars have offered is that Dias's relationship with the court had become complicated. His 1488 voyage had ended in near mutiny, his crew forcing him to turn back before he could push further into the Indian Ocean. That was not a mark against his courage, but it might have raised questions about whether he could maintain authority over a crew in extreme conditions. Another possibility is simply that Manuel wanted a fresh commander, someone whose loyalty was entirely to him and to this particular mission, rather than to the projects of the previous reign. There is also the question of what the mission actually required. This was not purely a voyage of exploration in the way that Dias's had been. Da Gama was not just being sent to find out whether the route was possible. That had been established. He was being sent as a representative of the Portuguese crown to make contact with the rulers of India, to negotiate trade agreements, to assess the political situation, and to return with proof that the sea route was commercially viable. That required a different kind of person. It required someone with diplomatic authority, someone who could present himself as an ambassador rather than just an explorer, someone with enough social standing and personal forcefulness to be taken seriously by foreign rulers. It also required, and this is the part that sounds blunter, someone willing to use violence when diplomacy failed. The Portuguese court understood that the Indian Ocean was not an empty space waiting to be discovered. It was a world of existing powers, existing trade networks, and existing interests that would not necessarily welcome Portuguese competition. Da Gama would need to be capable of both negotiation and coercion, sometimes within the same encounter. Whether Manuel chose Da Gama because he saw those qualities in him specifically, or whether the choice involved other factors, perhaps family connections, perhaps political calculations that are now invisible to us, is something we cannot say with complete certainty. What we can say is that the choice turned out to be consequential in ways that went well beyond seamanship. Da Gama's personality, his stubbornness, his capacity for cruelty, his genuine navigational competence, his refusal to accept failure, all of these things would shape the voyage in ways that a different commander might not have produced. He was not a warm man by the accounts that have survived. He was not the kind of leader who inspired devotion through personal charm. He was respected and feared more than he was loved. His crew would face extraordinary hardships, and he would drive them through those hardships with a combination of authority and determination that bordered, at times, on ruthlessness. On the outward voyage, he dealt with signs of dissent among his officers by having them arrested and their navigational instruments confiscated, making it clear that there was no going back, that the decision to continue was not open to collective discussion. That was not the action of a gentleman, but it may have been the action of a man who understood that the voyage would only succeed if it was completed, and that completion required eliminating any possibility of the crew convincing themselves to turn around. His brother Paulo da Gama sailed with the fleet, commanding the San Rafael, and this is one of the more human details in the story. The two brothers were apparently close, and Paulo's presence on the voyage suggests that Vasco had some say in the selection of his senior officers, or at least that the arrangement was acceptable to the crown. Paulo is consistently described in the surviving accounts as a gentler figure than his brother, better liked by the crew, more inclined toward patience. The contrast between the two is interesting. Vasco provided the iron will that kept the expedition moving forward. Paulo provided something softer, a kind of human warmth that may have helped hold the crew together during the worst of it. The 4 ships assembled for the voyage were built or specially modified for this purpose. The São Gabriel and São Rafael were naus, the heavier round-hulled ships designed for ocean sailing rather than coastal exploration. They were broader and more stable than caravels, better suited to carrying large amounts of cargo and provisions over long distances. They were also armed, carrying artillery pieces that would prove relevant later. The Berrio was a caravel, lighter and faster, more manoeuvrable. The 4th vessel, the supply ship, was a workhorse, carrying the extra food, water and equipment that a voyage of this length would require. The plan, which was followed, was to unload the supply ship's cargo into the other 3 vessels once it was no longer needed, and then to burn the supply ship rather than continue with a crew too small to sail 4 vessels. The ships were equipped with navigational instruments that represented the best available technology of the late 15th century. They carried astrolabes, quadrants, and magnetic compasses. They had tables for calculating latitude from the sun's altitude at noon. The pilots could determine how far north or south they were with reasonable accuracy. Longitude was another matter entirely. Calculating longitude at sea would not be solved for another 2.5 centuries, until the development of accurate marine chronometers in the 18th century. In 1497, the pilots worked with dead reckoning, estimating their east-west position based on their speed, heading, and elapsed time. It was an imperfect method, but experienced navigators could use it with surprising effectiveness, especially when combined with knowledge of currents and winds. The trade goods loaded onto the ships for presentation to Indian rulers and merchants included cloth, coral, tinware, honey, and various small items. Looking at this list now, knowing what lay ahead, it is hard not to feel a quiet sympathy for whoever assembled it. They were preparing gifts for the court of one of the most sophisticated trading civilizations in the world, a place where merchants from Arabia, Persia, and across Asia had been arriving for centuries with silks, gold, and precious goods. The Portuguese offerings were not exactly in that league, but the people doing the packing did not know that yet. They were working from limited information, doing their best to prepare for a world they had never seen. By the time the fleet was ready, the preparations had taken years in their cumulative sense, and months in their immediate sense. The ships had been tested, the crews assembled, the provisions loaded and checked, the padrones packed carefully in the hold. The letters from King Manuel, written in Arabic and intended for the Muslim rulers of the East African coast and India, were stowed away. The navigational charts, such as they were on board. The pilots knew their route as far as the Cape. Beyond that, they would rely on whatever knowledge they could gather as they went, and on the monsoon winds that Arab sailors had been using for centuries and that the Portuguese were counting on, somewhat on faith, to carry them across the Indian Ocean. The fleet was ready. The city of Lisbon was watching. The king had given his blessing and his instructions, and Vasco da Gama, this minor noble from a small coastal town, this experienced but not yet famous naval officer, this man chosen for reasons we can partly reconstruct but not entirely explain, was about to step into one of the most consequential voyages in the history of human movement across the planet. He was in his mid-30s probably, not young, not old. Experienced enough to know what the sea could do, and perhaps just confident enough or stubborn enough not to let that knowledge stop him. What happened next, the actual departure, the prayers on the shore, the crowds gathering at the water's edge, the ships moving out into the Tagus, and then into the open Atlantic, that is where the story truly begins to move. The morning of July 8th, 1497, arrived the way important mornings often do, quietly, without announcing itself, the sun coming up over the Tagus River the same way it always had, the water catching the light the same way it always did. And yet the docks at Restelo, just west of Lisbon, were anything but ordinary that day. People had gathered in large numbers. Accounts from the time describe a crowd on the shore, priests conducting prayers, the sound of singing, the smell of incense carried on the river air. Some of those watching were there out of pride and excitement. Some, almost certainly were there because they did not expect to see the men on those ships again. The ceremony before departure was a serious one. The night before sailing, the crew had kept a vigil at the small chapel of Nossa Senhora de Belém, a modest building that stood near the waterfront and that would later be replaced by the Grand Jerónimos Monastery, built partly in celebration of what was about to happen. They had prayed through the night, confessed their sins, received communion. These were men who understood that what they were about to do was dangerous in a way that went beyond ordinary maritime risk. They were sailing into genuinely unknown water, and they knew it. The religious preparation was not ceremonial formality. For most of them, it was real. They were making peace with the possibility that they might not come back. Da Gama himself received his standard and his letter of authority from King Manuel I in a formal ceremony. The king was not present at the docks, which was typical for royal protocol of the time, but his authority was everywhere in the proceedings. Da Gama was being sent as the representative of the Portuguese crown, with the power to negotiate on the king's behalf, to make agreements, to plant the stone padroins that would mark Portuguese claim, and to open a trade route that Portugal had been working toward for the better part of a century. The weight of that mandate was not abstract. It was present in every detail of that morning. When the fleet finally moved out onto the Tagus, the 4 ships would have made an impression even against the backdrop of a busy river port. The São Gabriel and São Rafael, the 2 larger vessels, were broad and sturdy, their hulls riding low with the weight of provisions loaded for a voyage expected to last many months. The Berrio sat lighter in the water beside them. The supply ship, unnamed in most accounts, completed the group. By the standards of the time, this was a well-equipped expedition. By the standards of the ocean they were about to cross, it was very small. The fleet sailed out of the Tagus and into the Atlantic, and here is where something worth pausing on occurred. Because the route they took was not the route that most people would assume. The obvious choice, the cautious choice, would have been to follow the African coast south, the way Portuguese ships had been doing for decades. Hug the coastline, stop at familiar ports, resupply at known locations, stay within reach of land. It was slower, but it was safer. It was the route that Bartolomeu Dias had taken on his own journey south a decade earlier. Da Gama and his pilots did not do that. Instead, after a stop at the Canary Islands and then at the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of West Africa, the fleet turned away from the African coast and sailed southwest, out into the open Atlantic, deliberately, intentionally. They were heading away from their destination, and they knew it. This was not an accident or a navigational error. It was a calculated decision based on a principle that Portuguese sailors had been developing and refining for decades, a technique known as the volta do mar, which translates roughly as the return of the sea or the swing of the sea. The idea behind the volta do mar was based on an understanding of the Atlantic wind systems. The trade winds that blow reliably along the African coast blow from the northeast, which is exactly the wrong direction if you're trying to sail south. Fighting headwinds for thousands of miles is exhausting, slow and hard on ships and crews. But if you swing out into the central Atlantic, you eventually find the westerlies, winds that blow from the southwest and then from the west, and these winds can carry a ship in a long curving arc back toward the southeast, toward the Cape of Good Hope, far more efficiently than any coastal route could manage. Portuguese navigators had discovered this principle through their earlier Atlantic voyages, their exploration of the Azores and Madeira and the sea lanes between them, and by 1497 it was established enough that Da Gama's pilots could apply it with confidence. What makes this decision remarkable is the sheer scale of what it required. To execute the Volta de Mar properly on a voyage to the Cape of Good Hope, the fleet had to sail southwest into the open Atlantic for weeks. Some historians believe they went as far south and west as the latitude of present-day Brazil, possibly coming within a few hundred miles of the South American coast without knowing it. They were not looking for Brazil. They were not looking for anything except the right winds. But the distance they covered in that arc, out into empty ocean and then curving back east, was enormous. by the time they completed the swing and began heading back toward Africa, they had been at sea for roughly 3 months and had sailed something in the region of 6,000 miles, a large portion of it with no land in sight whatsoever. 3 months out of sight of land. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. These were men who lived in a world without radio, without GPS, without satellite weather forecasting, without any way to call for help or to know what lay ahead. Their position at any given moment was an educated estimate, calculated from the sun's altitude at noon, from the stars at night, from the compass bearing they had been holding, from the speed they had been travelling. They could tell you their latitude with reasonable confidence. Their longitude was a best guess. The ocean around them was empty in every direction, and they stayed out there, sailing through it for 3 months. The weeks in the open Atlantic were not without difficulty. The weather in the South Atlantic is not uniformly kind, and there would have been storms, heavy swells, days when the wind dropped and the ship sat rolling in the heat, days when it came back hard and the crew worked exhausted through the night to keep the sails managed. Provisions had to be carefully rationed from the beginning. Fresh water was a constant concern on any long voyage. The crew were living in cramped, damp, uncomfortable conditions below deck, eating salted meat, hardtack, dried fish, olive oil, vinegar, and whatever else had been loaded in Lisbon. It was not pleasant, but it was what sailors of that period expected. They had signed on knowing what the conditions would be like. The stop at the Cape Verde Islands, which came before the long Atlantic arc, had given the fleet a chance to take on fresh water and supplies. The Cape Verde Islands sit about 400 miles off the coast of Senegal, and they had been a Portuguese possession since the 1460s, so this was familiar territory, a known waypoint, a last point of reliable resupply before the unknown stretched out ahead. After Cape Verde, the fleet turned southwest and the open ocean began. There is something almost vertiginous about imagining the view from the deck of one of those ships during those weeks. In every direction, water. The horizon, a perfect circle of sea and sky, moving with the ship, never getting any closer or farther away. At night, the stars of the southern hemisphere gradually rising higher as the fleet moved south, unfamiliar constellations replacing the ones the sailors had grown up with. The Southern Cross, which becomes visible from around 15 degrees south latitude, would have been a notable sight for men who had spent their lives navigating by the North Star. The sea itself would have changed in character as they moved deeper into the South Atlantic, the colour shifting, the swell patterns changing, the temperature of the air and water gradually dropping as they moved further from the equator. The pilots were watching all of this carefully. Not just the stars, but the colour of the water, the presence or absence of certain birds and fish, the direction and feel of the wind, the character of the swells. Navigation in this period was not purely mathematical. It was also observational, almost sensory, built from accumulated experience and careful attention to the behaviour of the ocean itself. The men who guided these ships were skilled in ways that are genuinely hard to appreciate from a modern perspective, because so much of what they knew lived in their bodies and their memory, rather than in instruments or charts. At some point during the long arc, the wind shifted in the way the pilots had been waiting for, and the fleet began curving back toward the east. Africa was out there somewhere ahead of them, though they could not see it. The calculations said it should be there. The wind was pushing them toward it, and eventually, after those extraordinary weeks of open ocean, land appeared on the horizon again. They had arrived on the southeastern coast of Africa, somewhere in the vicinity of present-day South Africa, having completed one of the longest open ocean passages that any European fleet had ever attempted. The exact landfall is recorded as St. Helena Bay, on the western coast of South Africa, where they stopped to repair the ships, take on water, and allow the crew to rest. The ships needed attention after weeks at sea. Ropes had to be checked, sails examined, hulls inspected. The men needed fresh food, or at least something other than what they had been eating since the Cape Verde Islands. There was an encounter here with local Khoikhoi people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region, which began cautiously, and ended in a brief violent confrontation when a misunderstanding led to da Gama being struck by a spear. He was not seriously hurt, but it was an early reminder that every landing in this part of the world carried the potential for tension. After St Helena Bay, the fleet moved south toward the Cape of Good Hope, and here the mood on the ships would have shifted. They were entering the waters that Bartolomeo Diaz had navigated 9 years earlier, the waters that had given Diaz such a terrible time that he had named the Cape of Storms, before the king renamed it more hopefully. The reputation of this place was known to every man on the fleet. The Cape of Good Hope sits at the meeting point of the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, and the weather there can be ferocious. Cold fronts sweep up from Antarctica. The swells can be enormous. The wind can shift without warning. Diaz had barely made it through, and his crew had eventually refused to go further. Da Gama's fleet was approaching the same stretch of water, and the season was working in their favour to some degree. They were arriving in late November, which is late spring in the southern hemisphere, a somewhat better time than Diaz had faced. But the Cape does not become gentle simply because the calendar says it should be. The passage ahead would be its own challenge, and the men on those 4 ships knew it. The African coast was running out. The southern tip was close, and beyond it lay the Indian Ocean, which no European ship had ever sailed, and which was the entire reason they had come this far. The story of what happened when they rounded the Cape, the storms, the cold, the entry into entirely unknown water, and the long eastern coast of Africa that stretched ahead of them, that is where the next part of this voyage begins. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope in late November 1497, and the exact date recorded in the expedition's log is the 22nd of that month. It was not a gentle passage. The accounts that survive describe violent seas, cold winds driving in from the southwest, and swells that were large enough to make the ships labour heavily. For the crew, this was the moment they had been dreading since they left Lisbon. The Cape had a reputation, and the reputation was earned. The seas at the southern tip of Africa are not simply rough in the way that rough weather is rough. They are rough in a sustained structural way, because the ocean there has almost no land to interrupt it. Cold water from the Antarctic pushes north and meets the warmer water of the Atlantic. The 2 currents create upwellings, confused seas, and winds that can change direction faster than a crew can respond. The ships would have been heaving and plunging, the rigging straining, the decks wet and cold. Men would have been clinging to whatever they could hold. Sleep would have been almost impossible, and yet they made it through. The Cape was rounded. The fleet held together. All 4 ships came through the passage intact, which was not something anyone could have guaranteed beforehand. There is a quiet detail worth pausing on here. Bartolomeo Diaz, the man who had first rounded this same Cape 9 years earlier, had actually sailed with da Gama's fleet as far as the Cape Verde Islands. He was not on the voyage to India, but he had been part of the preparation, part of the convoy that left Lisbon together in July. The 2 men would have spoken. Diaz would have described what the Cape was like, what to expect, what had frightened his own crew. And then at the Cape Verde Islands, Diaz had turned off toward his own assignment, a different destination, leaving da Gama to continue south. There is something quietly poignant about that. The man who had first cracked the door open, who had proven that Africa had a southern tip and that the Indian Ocean was reachable, sailing alongside the fleet that would now walk through that door and then peeling away before the destination was reached. Diaz would never reach India himself. He would die in a storm near this same cape in 1500, on a different voyage entirely. But in November 1497, he was still alive, and the knowledge he had carried back from 1488 was embedded in every decision da Gama's pilots were making as they pressed south. Once they were past the Cape, the character of the sea changed. The Indian Ocean is different from the South Atlantic in ways that the sailors would have noticed gradually rather than all at once. The colour of the water shifts. The temperature of the air begins to rise as you move north and east away from the Antarctic influence. The swells have a different rhythm, longer and more rolling, shaped by different wind patterns and different geography. For the Portuguese sailors, This was now genuinely unknown territory. Every mile north and east was a mile no European ship had ever covered. The charts they carried became less reliable, and then unreliable, and then essentially blank. The pilots were navigating by observation, by calculation, and by whatever information had been gathered from Arab and Indian sources in Lisbon before the voyage departed. The first stop on the eastern side of Africa was a place the Portuguese called Aguada de Sobras, which is present-day Mossel Bay in South Africa. They arrived there in late November and stayed for about 13 days. This was a working stop. The ships needed attention after the Cape Passage. The supply ship, which had been carrying extra provisions and equipment for exactly this kind of situation, was unloaded and dismantled here. Its timber was used for repairs, its cargo distributed among the remaining 3 ships. The supply ship had done its job. It had carried what was needed to get the fleet this far, and now it was broken up on a beach in southern Africa, its wood becoming part of the other vessels that would continue the voyage. At Mossel Bay, the fleet had its first significant encounter with the Khoi people of the region. The initial contact was tentative but not hostile. There was some trading, small exchanges of goods, a kind of cautious mutual curiosity. The Khoi had encountered Portuguese sailors before, because Bartolomeu Dias had stopped at this same bay in 1488, and the encounter then had ended in violence, with Dias killing a Khoi man in a confrontation. The memory of that encounter may well have shaped how the local people approached this new group of ships. Despite the caution on both sides, the early exchanges at Mossel Bay went reasonably well. The Portuguese managed to obtain an ox, which they slaughtered and ate. After weeks of salted provisions, fresh meat would have been a significant thing. Then, as seems to have been almost inevitable in these early contact situations, things deteriorated. A misunderstanding or a perceived threat led to the Portuguese firing a bombard, a kind of small cannon, and the Khoi scattered. The trading ended. The fleet finished its repairs, erected one of the stone padrones that they had brought from Lisbon as a marker of Portuguese presence, and moved on. The padrones are worth a brief mention. These were limestone pillars, inscribed with the Portuguese royal arms, the name of the king, and the date of the expedition. They had been specially made in Portugal and carried on the voyage specifically to be planted at significant points along the route, claiming the territory for the Portuguese crown. Several had already been planted during the voyage south along the African coast. The one at Mossel Bay was another in that sequence. The practice says something about how the Portuguese understood what they were doing. This was not purely an act of exploration or trade. It was an act of formal possession, a declaration made in stone that Portugal had been here, that Portugal claimed this place. The people who actually lived in these places were not consulted, of course. The stone pillars were planted for an audience back in Lisbon and in the courts of Europe, not for the people standing on the beach watching the Portuguese sailors work. After Mossel Bay, the fleet moved northeast along the coast, and here the landscape and the culture began to change significantly. The southeastern coast of Africa, moving up through what is now South Africa and into Mozambique, is a long and varied coastline. The Portuguese were following it carefully, watching for harbours, fresh water, and signs of population. By late December 1497, they had reached the mouth of a river they called the Rio de Cobre, and shortly afterward they stopped at a place they named Terra da Boa Gente, the land of good people, where another encounter with local Bantu-speaking people went more peacefully than the one at Mossel Bay. There was trading, there was music, and there was at least a temporary sense of goodwill. Da Gama noted in the expedition records that the people here seemed friendly, and the land seemed fertile. But as the fleet continued north into the Mozambique Channel, the world they were entering was changing in a more fundamental way. They were leaving the fringes and entering the core of the Indian Ocean trading world. The East African coast, from roughly present-day Mozambique northward through Tanzania and Kenya, was not a remote or undeveloped region. It was home to a series of sophisticated Swahili city-states that had been deeply integrated into Indian Ocean trade networks for centuries. These were cities with mosques, with stone buildings, with markets selling goods from Arabia, Persia, India, and China. The people who lived here were Muslim, multilingual, cosmopolitan, and wealthy. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were already the centre of their own world. The first major Swahili settlement the Portuguese encountered was on Mozambique Island, a small island just off the northern Mozambique coast, which they reached in early March 1498. The island was a significant trading port, with a substantial Muslim population and regular connections to Arabia and India. The Sultan of Mozambique initially received the Portuguese with some cordiality. Da Gama, trying to gather information and establish goodwill, presented himself and his crew as Christians, which was true, though the description of where they came from was somewhat vague. The Sultan offered to provide pilots who could guide the fleet to India, and for a brief moment things seemed to be going well. Then the situation began to unravel. The Arab merchants in Mozambique, who had their own deep interests in the Indian Ocean trade, recognised the Portuguese as potential rivals and worked to undermine the relationship. The gifts that da Gama had brought from Portugal, which had seemed reasonable in Lisbon, were embarrassingly inadequate by the standards of this wealthy trading port. Striped cloth, coral beads, wash basins, bells, and a few pieces of sugar were not the kind of goods that impressed a sultan who was accustomed to receiving fine textiles from India and porcelain from China. The atmosphere cooled. The pilots that had been promised were withdrawn. By the time the Portuguese left Mozambique, they had fired their bombards at the town in frustration, and the relationship had broken down entirely. This pattern, a tentative opening, a misreading of local expectations, a deterioration into hostility, would repeat itself along the coast. At Mombasa, the major port city on the coast of what is now Kenya, the reception was actively hostile from the start. The Arab traders there had received word of the Portuguese from Mozambique and were prepared. There were attempts to lure the ships into a position where they could be seized. Da Gama, suspicious and cautious, kept his fleet anchored offshore and refused to move into the harbour. The tension was considerable. At one point, the Portuguese tortured 2 of their captive pilots by dripping boiling oil on them to extract information about the local intentions, which says something about the methods da Gama was prepared to use when he felt threatened. The fleet left Mombasa without having made any useful contact and moved further north. And then, at Malindi, something different happened. Malindi was another Swahili city-state, smaller than Mombasa but with its own political interests, and crucially, it was a rival of Mombasa. The Sultan of Malindi, seeing in the Portuguese a potential counterweight against his more powerful neighbour, chose to receive them warmly. There was feasting, there was music, there were gifts exchanged that were actually appropriate to the occasion. For the first time on the African coast, the Portuguese found themselves in a genuinely hospitable situation. The Sultan and da Gama met on their respective boats anchored close together, speaking through interpreters, and the conversation was productive. Most importantly, the Sultan of Malindi agreed to provide a pilot who could guide the fleet across the Indian Ocean to India. The identity of this pilot has been debated by historians for a long time. The name most often associated with him is Ahmad ibn Majid, who was one of the most celebrated Arab navigators of the 15th century, a man who had written extensively about Indian Ocean navigation, and whose knowledge of the monsoon winds and the routes between Arabia, East Africa and India was essentially unmatched. Whether the pilot was actually Ibn Majid himself, or a different skilled navigator, is not entirely settled. Some historians accept the identification, others are more sceptical, pointing to inconsistencies in the dates and the accounts. What is not in doubt is that the pilot provided to da Gama at Malindi was genuinely expert, someone who knew the Indian Ocean in the way that the Portuguese pilots knew the Atlantic, through long experience and deep accumulated knowledge. The fleet rested at Malindi for several days, taking on fresh provisions and allowing the crew to recover. The men were tired. The voyage had been going on for nearly 9 months. They had been through the Cape. They had navigated an unfamiliar coast. They had dealt with hostility and tension at nearly every stop. The rest at Malindi, with its relative warmth and hospitality, must have felt like a genuine reprieve. But the Indian Ocean still lay ahead, and the crossing to India was the whole point of everything they had done. The pilot was aboard. The monsoon winds, which the pilot knew how to read and use, were beginning to shift in the right direction. The fleet was as ready as it was going to be. In late April 1498, Vasco da Gama's 3 remaining ships left the harbour at Malindi and turned their bows east into the open Indian Ocean. The coast of Africa fell away behind them. Ahead was water and more water, and somewhere beyond it the coast of India. The Arab and Indian sailors had been making this crossing for centuries. The monsoon winds made it possible, even reliable, if you knew the season and the route. But for the Portuguese, this was the last and most uncertain step of a voyage that had already pushed well beyond anything Europeans had attempted before. The pilot stood at the bow, or wherever pilots stood, reading the wind and the water, guiding the fleet toward a destination he had been to many times before and they had never seen. The crossing had begun, and the weeks ahead would determine whether everything they had done since leaving Lisbon would finally arrive at its purpose. What da Gama had encountered along the East African coast was not a collection of isolated villages or simple fishing communities. It was a civilization. That is the word that fits, even if European accounts of the time were slow to use it in that direction. The Swahili coast, stretching roughly from present-day Somalia in the north, down through Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, had been a functioning part of the Indian Ocean trade world for centuries before any Portuguese ship appeared on the horizon. The cities there, Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, Mozambique Island, Pate, and others, were not peripheral. They were nodes in a network that connected East Africa to Arabia, Persia, the western coast of India, and beyond. Goods moved through these ports constantly. Gold came up from the interior of Africa, from the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe and the regions around it. Ivory, iron, copper, tortoiseshell, and enslaved people also moved through these ports, traded into networks that reached across the entire ocean. In return, the Swahili cities received fine cotton textiles from India, porcelain from China, glass beads from Persia and Arabia, and the kinds of luxury goods that accumulate in places where serious wealth concentrates. The architecture of these cities reflected that wealth. Stone buildings, mosques with carved wooden doors, palaces with plastered walls, courtyards designed for shade and conversation. The great mosque at Kilwa, portions of which still stand today, was built in the 11th century and expanded over the following centuries into one of the most impressive structures in sub-Saharan Africa. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveller who visited Kilwa in 1331, described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world, well built and elegantly constructed. He was not easily impressed. He had been to Cairo, to Constantinople, to Delhi. His praise means something. By the time da Gama arrived a century and a half later, these cities had been refining their trade relationships, their architecture, their legal systems, and their cultural identities for generations. They were Muslim, most of them, having converted gradually over the preceding centuries through contact with Arab and Persian traders. They spoke Swahili, a Bantu language that had absorbed a significant vocabulary from Arabic, a linguistic record of the trade connections that had shaped the coast. The ruling families in many of these cities had intermarried with Arab and Persian merchants over generations, creating a cosmopolitan elite that was neither purely African nor purely Arab, but genuinely its own thing. So when the Portuguese arrived, they were not arriving in a place that needed to be introduced to commerce or civilization. They were arriving as newcomers in a world that already knew exactly what it was doing. And the people of the Swahili coast could see, fairly quickly, that these particular newcomers were not simply traders. The ships were armed with cannons. The men were not merchants in the ordinary sense. They were carrying the instruments of a state-sponsored project, not just looking to buy and sell, but to establish a presence, to gather intelligence, and to find a route that would allow Portugal to bypass the entire existing system of middlemen and reach the source of the goods directly. The Arab merchants who operated along the coast understood this threat instinctively, because they were sophisticated business people who had been navigating the politics of Indian Ocean trade for a long time. They had built relationships, maintained trust, operated within understood rules. A new maritime power arriving with heavy guns and ambitions to monopolise a trade route was not a neutral event. It was a threat to everything they had built. Their resistance to the Portuguese at Mozambique and Mombasa was not irrational or merely hostile. It was a reasonable response to a real danger. The fact that da Gama's fleet eventually found a sympathetic reception at Malindi does not change what the earlier encounters revealed about the wider situation. The Portuguese were not welcome because they had not yet earned a place in this world, and the people who lived there could see, even in 1498, that the intentions behind those 4 ships were not entirely peaceful. Malindi itself was a city of perhaps a few thousand people, smaller than Mombasa, built on a low headland overlooking a natural harbour. The buildings were of coral stone, whitewashed, the streets narrow and shaded. The harbour would have been busy with dhows, the traditional lateen-rigged sailing vessels that had carried Indian Ocean trade for centuries. Dhows were extraordinary vessels, well adapted to the monsoon winds, capable of long ocean crossings and constructed without metal nails, the planks of the hull stitched together with coconut fibre cord in the traditional method. They looked fragile to European eyes, but were in fact well suited to the conditions they operated in. A skilled dhow captain could read the monsoon winds and the ocean currents the way a musician reads a score, not just understanding the notes, but feeling the rhythm beneath them. The Sultan of Malindi, who received da Gama in April 1498, was playing his own political game, as rulers tend to do. His city's rivalry with Mombasa was real and long-standing, and the arrival of a powerful armed fleet from a distant Christian kingdom offered a potential advantage. An alliance with the Portuguese, or at least a demonstration of good relations, might provide leverage against his neighbours. This kind of pragmatic calculation was entirely normal in the politics of the Swahili coast, where city-states negotiated, competed, and occasionally fought with each other over trade routes and regional influence. The Sultan was not naive about what the Portuguese were. He was making a considered decision that a relationship with them served his interests better than opposition. That calculation would have complicated consequences over the following decades, as the Portuguese returned in force and the nature of their ambitions became fully apparent. But in the spring of 1498, it produced something that da Gama desperately needed: a pilot who could guide him across the Indian Ocean. The crossing itself, which began in late April 1498, was approximately 2,400 miles from the East African coast to the Malabar coast of India. That is roughly the distance from London to the middle of the Sahara Desert, except it is entirely open ocean, with no landmarks, no ports, no possibility of turning aside if something goes wrong. For Arab and Indian sailors, this crossing was well understood. The monsoon winds made it almost routine during the right season. The northeast monsoon, which blows from roughly November to March, carries ships from India toward Africa. The southwest monsoon, which builds from around April and strengthens through the summer, carries ships back from Africa toward India. This seasonal reversal of the prevailing winds across the Indian Ocean was the engine that had powered Indian Ocean trade for millennia. Sailors who understood the monsoon could plan their voyages around it with reasonable confidence. Sailors who did not understand it or who arrived at the wrong time of year could find themselves fighting headwinds for weeks or stranded waiting for the season to change. The pilot provided at Malindi understood all of this completely. Whether he was Ahmad ibn Majid, that celebrated navigator and author of detailed sailing manuals about Indian Ocean routes, or a different expert, he knew how to read the signs of the southwest monsoon's arrival, how to set a course that used the winds efficiently, and how to navigate by the stars across a stretch of ocean that had no visible features to guide by. The Portuguese had their own navigational tools, the astrolabe and the quadrant for measuring the altitude of the sun or stars, and their own methods of dead reckoning, estimating position from speed and direction over time. These were not primitive techniques. But the Indian Ocean was not the Atlantic, and the specific knowledge of its winds, currents, and seasonal patterns was something that had been accumulated over centuries of experience by sailors from Arabia, India, and the Swahili coast. The pilot carried that knowledge. Da Gama had the ships and the will to use them. The combination was what made the crossing possible. On board the fleet during those weeks at sea, life would have settled into the rhythms that long ocean passages imposed. Watches rotated, sails were adjusted. The cook worked in the small galley built into the forward part of the ship, preparing whatever food remained from the last provisioning stop. By this point in the voyage, fresh provisions were a memory. The diet was hardtack, dried fish, salt meat, olive oil, vinegar, and whatever could be caught from the sea. Water was carefully rationed. The ships were crowded and not particularly clean by any standard. The crew slept in shifts, some on deck and some below, in the cramped dark hold that smelled of bilge water and cargo, and the accumulated humanity of months at sea. The ships were not large. The St. Gabriel, the flagship, was perhaps 27 metres long and around 150 tons burden. By comparison, a modern ocean-going fishing trawler is typically larger. To cross the Indian Ocean in a vessel that size without any certainty of what lay at the other end required a particular kind of courage, or possibly a particular kind of inability to fully imagine the alternative. The stars overhead during that crossing would have been different from the stars the Portuguese had grown up navigating by. The Southern Cross, which had been a useful reference since they rounded the Cape, was visible. The constellations of the northern sky that European sailors used as familiar guides were lower on the horizon or absent entirely. The pilot would have read these skies with the ease of a long practice, understanding the positions of stars that Portuguese navigators were still learning to interpret. The ocean itself was different from the Atlantic. The colour of the water changes in the Indian Ocean, particularly in the areas influenced by the monsoon currents. Flying fish launched themselves from the waves and occasionally landed on deck, which was both startling and useful. The heat increased as they moved north toward the equator, and then slightly south again as they angled toward the Malabar coast. There is a particular quality to those long stretches of open ocean that experienced sailors describe in consistent ways across cultures and centuries. Time becomes elastic. Days blur into each other. The horizon is always the same distance away, which means the sense of progress is entirely abstract, a matter of calculation and faith rather than visible evidence. The sky and the sea fill the entire world, till the land becomes almost theoretical. The men on those ships had not seen a coast for weeks. They had left Africa behind and had not yet found India. They were suspended between two worlds, carried by winds that a pilot from a civilization they had barely met understood better than they did, toward a destination that none of them had ever seen. It is a strange thing to hold in the mind. These were not reckless adventurers in the Hollywood sense. They were professional sailors doing a difficult job under conditions of genuine uncertainty, far from home, dependent on knowledge and skills they had partly borrowed from people whose world they were about to disrupt. And then, on the 20th of May, 1498, after approximately 23 days at sea from Malindi, the lookout would have seen it. A darkening on the horizon that was not a cloud, a line of green above the water, the smell of vegetation carried on the wind, the particular richness of tropical land after weeks of salt air. The coast of India. Specifically, the Malabar coast of what is now the state of Kerala, in the southwestern corner of the Indian subcontinent. The city ahead was Calicut, known today as Kozhikode, one of the most important spice trading ports in the world. Pepper grew in the hills behind it, cinnamon, ginger, cardamom. The things that had driven this entire enterprise, the things that had made men look at a blank space on a map and decide to sail into it, were here, a few miles away. The enormity of that moment is genuinely difficult to overstate. Da Gama and his crew had left Lisbon 10 months and 12 days earlier. They had sailed down the length of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, up the East African coast through a world of sophisticated trading cities and tense diplomatic encounters, and across the open Indian Ocean with the help of a pilot whose civilization they were only beginning to understand. They had lost men to illness and accident. They had fired their cannons at an African town in frustration. They had tortured captive pilots for information. They had spent weeks at sea in conditions of genuine hardship. And now, finally, the coast of India was in front of them. The sea route that Portugal had been trying to find for decades, the route that Bartolomeu Dias had proven was theoretically possible in 1488, and that da Gama had been sent to complete, was no longer theoretical. It existed. They had sailed it. The blank edge of the European map had been filled in, and what lay beyond it was not emptiness but a world of staggering complexity, wealth, and history that the Portuguese were about to encounter for the first time. The ships moved toward the shore, the anchor chains ready, the crew watching the unfamiliar coastline take shape in the late afternoon light. Whatever happened next, the voyage itself had already changed everything. They dropped anchor near the coast and waited. The Portuguese had arrived at one of the great trading cities of the medieval world, but they did not yet know exactly what that meant. From the deck of the São Gabriel, Calicut would have appeared as a low, dense settlement stretching along a coastline backed by green hills. The air was thick and warm, smelling of spices and vegetation, and the particular humidity of a tropical coast in late spring. After weeks of open ocean, the richness of it must have been almost overwhelming. Sounds would have carried across the water. Voices, the movement of boats, the ordinary noise of the busy port that had been receiving ships from Arabia, Persia, and the rest of India for centuries before any Portuguese sailor was born. Da Gama sent a small boat ashore first, cautiously, as he had done at every unfamiliar coast. The man who went ashore was a convict, one of several condemned criminals carried on the voyage specifically for situations like this. Men who could be sent into uncertain territory because their lives were considered more expendable than those of the regular crew. It was a cold calculation, but not unusual for the time. The convict made contact with local people and was eventually brought before some merchants who spoke enough Arabic for rough communication. When he returned to the ship and reported what he had found, da Gama prepared for a more formal landing. The first proper meeting ashore was arranged through intermediaries, and da Gama sent one of his men, João Nunes, who spoke some Arabic, to meet with local officials. What Nunes encountered on that first trip ashore was something that caused a great deal of confusion among the Portuguese. He was taken to a large building with elaborate carvings and what appeared to be religious images inside. The Portuguese believed it was a Christian church. They knelt and prayed. The images they saw were almost certainly Hindu deities, figures with multiple arms, elaborate iconography, entirely unlike anything in a European church. But the Portuguese, searching for the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John that European tradition insisted existed somewhere in the East, convinced themselves they had found a Christian place of worship. It was a misunderstanding that would take some time to fully unravel, and it says something about the limits of what da Gama and his men actually knew about the world they had sailed into. The city of Calicut in 1498 was ruled by a Hindu king known by the title Zamarin, a word derived from the Malayalam term Samuthiri, meaning Lord of the Sea. The Zamarin at that time was a powerful figure who controlled the most important pepper-producing region in the world, and whose city was a hub of the Indian Ocean trade network. Calicut's population included Hindu merchants, Mappila Muslims who'd been trading along this coast for generations, and had deep connections to Arabia, Jewish traders, and visiting merchants from across the Indian Ocean world. It was a genuinely cosmopolitan city, comfortable with commerce, accustomed to receiving foreign visitors, and perfectly capable of evaluating exactly what those visitors had to offer. Da Gama's formal audience with the Zamorin came after several days of negotiation and arrangement. He was carried to the palace in a palanquin, which was a mark of some respect, and the meeting itself was conducted with ceremony on both sides. The Zamorin received him in a large hall, reclining on a couch, attended by officials and courtiers. Da Gama delivered his message. He was an ambassador from the King of Portugal. He had come in peace, and he wished to establish trade relations between Portugal and Calicut. The Zamorin listened, and then the gifts were presented. This is where things became awkward in a way that was hard to recover from. Da Gama had brought gifts intended to impress an Indian ruler, but the selection reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of who the Zamorin actually was and what he was accustomed to receiving. The gifts included striped cloth, scarlet hoods, hats, strings of coral, hand basins, sugar, oil, and honey. These were the kinds of goods that might have impressed a chief along the African coast, or perhaps a minor official somewhere. They were not appropriate for one of the wealthiest and most powerful rulers in the Indian Ocean world. The Zamorin's courtiers reportedly laughed. Arab merchants present at the court, and there were several, men who understood exactly what the Portuguese arrival meant for their own trade interests, pointed out that even the poorest merchant from Arabia brought gold when seeking an audience with the Zamorin. Da Gama had brought wash basins and hats. The Arab merchants in Calicut had recognised the Portuguese almost immediately for what they were, a direct commercial threat. If Portugal established a sea route to India, the Arab middlemen who had controlled the flow of spices from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean for centuries would be bypassed entirely. Their livelihoods, their trade networks, their political influence, all of it was at risk. So they did what any rational actor in their position would do. They worked actively to undermine Da Gama's negotiations, warning the Zamorin that the Portuguese were pirates, not merchants, and that allowing them to trade would bring trouble. They were not entirely wrong about that, as later events would prove. But in the short term, their intervention made Da Gama's already difficult position considerably worse. The weeks that followed were tense and frustrating for the Portuguese. Da Gama was permitted to trade, but under conditions that felt restrictive and humiliating. He managed to obtain some pepper, cinnamon and cloves and a small amount of precious stones, but nothing close to what he had hoped for. The Zamorin was not hostile exactly, but he was not particularly interested either. He had dozens of trading partners. He did not need the Portuguese badly enough to risk antagonizing the Arab merchants, who were a far more established and reliable part of his commercial world. There were several moments during those weeks when the situation seemed close to breaking down entirely. Da Gama was detained at one point, essentially held under house arrest while the Zamorin's officials tried to extract a payment of customs duties that Da Gama refused to pay, arguing that he was a royal ambassador and not subject to such fees. It took days of tense back and forth before he was allowed to return to his ships. He left behind a few Portuguese men as informal representatives, though whether they stayed willingly is not entirely clear. By late August 1498, Da Gama had decided to leave. He had been in Calicut for roughly 3 months, and the situation was not improving. Before departing, he took a number of Indians aboard his ships, some of them apparently willing passengers who wanted to see Portugal, and some of them effectively hostages, taken to ensure safe passage and to bring back to Lisbon as evidence that the voyage had reached India. This was not an unusual practice by the standards of the time, but it was not the kind of thing that built goodwill. The fleet left the coast of Calicut in late August 1498 and began the return voyage. And this is where the second half of the journey, in some ways the harder half, begins. Sailing to India from East Africa with the summer monsoon behind you is one thing. Sailing back against those same winds is another problem entirely. The monsoon that had carried the fleet from Malindi to Calicut in approximately 23 days now blew directly against them. The return crossing of the Indian Ocean took not 3 weeks, but nearly 3 months. From late August until late January of the following year, the fleet struggled against headwinds, variable currents, and the grinding physical toll of a voyage that had already been going on for over a year. The crossing back was brutal in a way that the outward journey had not been. Scurvy, which had been a manageable problem on the way to India, became catastrophic on the return. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, and after months at sea with no fresh fruit or vegetables, the body begins to break down in specific and terrible ways. The gums swell and darken, the teeth loosen and fall out. Old wounds that had healed begin to reopen. The skin bruises easily, the joints ache severely. Men become too weak to stand their watch. In advanced cases, the disease is fatal. By the time the fleet reached the East African coast, the crews were devastated. Da Gama himself reportedly broke down weeping at one point, not something the records dwell on, but a detail that appears in at least one account of the voyage, and it is not hard to understand why. He'd set out with around 170 men across 4 ships. The numbers were now drastically reduced. Men had died of illness, of accidents, of the accumulated hardships of a voyage that had lasted well over a year. The ships themselves were suffering too. Rigging worn, hulls fouled, supplies depleted. When the fleet reached the East African coast and stopped at Malindi again, the Sultan received them with the same relative friendliness he had shown on the outward journey. Fresh provisions were obtained. The sick were helped as much as possible, but the damage was done. The crew was too small to manage 3 ships effectively. Da Gama made a decision that was practically necessary but still jarring to contemplate. The São Rafael, the ship commanded by his brother Paulo da Gama on the outward voyage, was stripped of everything useful and burned. There were simply not enough men left to sail it home. 2 ships remained, the São Gabriel and the Berrio. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope in late March 1499, fighting the same storms that Bartolomeu Dias had encountered 11 years earlier. The Cape did not become easier simply because it had been rounded before. The swells were massive, the winds cold and violent, and the ships were in poor condition with exhausted crews. Getting past the Cape was a feat in itself. On the Atlantic side of Africa, the 2 ships became separated in rough weather. The Berrio, commanded by Nicolau Coelho, made faster progress and arrived in Lisbon in July 1499, the first ship of the fleet to return. The São Gabriel arrived later, though Da Gama himself was not on it. He had transferred to a faster vessel at the Cape Verde Islands because his brother Paulo was gravely ill and he wanted to reach the Azores as quickly as possible. Paulo da Gama died in the Azores before Vasco could do anything to help him. It was a personal loss at the end of a voyage already full of loss. What the survivors brought back to Lisbon was a cargo of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and other spices, along with precious stones and a small amount of other goods. The exact value varies depending on the source, but the most commonly cited figure is that the spices alone were worth roughly 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. Some accounts put the profit even higher. The economics were, by any measure, extraordinary. Portugal had gambled an enormous amount of money, 4 ships, and the lives of 170 men, and had come back with proof that the gamble worked. But the human cost is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on to what the voyage meant politically and commercially. Of the roughly 170 men who had left Lisbon in July 1497, fewer than 60 returned. That is a mortality rate of well over 60%. 2 ships were gone. Men had died of scurvy, of illness, of violence, of simple exhaustion. The families of those men received no particular recognition. The survivors were not wealthy. Da Gama himself received titles and honours, but the ordinary sailors who had done the actual work of keeping the ships moving for 2 years received considerably less. This is how it generally went then as now when the rewards of a great enterprise are distributed. King Manuel I of Portugal celebrated the return with genuine enthusiasm. He understood immediately what it meant. Portugal now possessed something no other European nation had, a proven sea route to the spice markets of India. The overland routes controlled by the Ottoman Empire and the Arab middlemen, the routes that had made spices expensive and unreliable for European buyers, could now be bypassed entirely. Lisbon was about to become one of the most important trading cities in the world. the implications rippled outward almost immediately. Other merchants, other rulers, other navigators understood what the return of da Gama's fleet meant. The world had just been reorganised, at least from the European perspective, and the reorganisation was not going to stop with one voyage. Portugal was already planning the next expedition, a much larger one, with more ships and a clearer sense of what they were sailing toward. The sea route to India was no longer a question or a hope, it was a fact. And what would be done with that fact in the years and decades that followed would shape the history of two continents and every ocean between them. So the fleet had returned, the route was proven, the spices were real. And now, sitting somewhere inside all of that triumph, was a city that most Europeans had never seen, had barely imagined, and had certainly never visited by sea. Calicut. It is worth going back to it now, because the story of what actually happened when Vasco da Gama arrived on the Malabar coast is considerably more complicated, more awkward, and more human than the clean version of the story tends to suggest. Calicut in 1498 was not a small place. It was one of the most important trading cities on the entire Indian Ocean network. Its harbour received ships from Arabia, Persia, the Red Sea ports, the Gulf of Aden, the coasts of East Africa, and from further east across the Bay of Bengal. Merchants from dozens of different cultures moved through its markets. The city sat on the southwestern coast of India, in the region known as the Malabar Coast, which is today the state of Kerala. The climate was warm and wet, shaped by the same monsoon winds that had carried da Gama across the ocean. The land behind the city was green and dense, thick with the pepper vines and spice trees that had made the region famous for centuries. The smell of the place, if you stood near the harbour in the right season, was reportedly extraordinary. Pepper, cardamom, ginger, cinnamon, not as dry packaged goods, but as living crops being processed, traded, and loaded onto ships. The city was ruled by a Hindu king whose title was the Zamorin, a Portuguese rendering of the Malayalam word Samoothiri, meaning Lord of the Sea. The Zamorin was a powerful figure, not just militarily but commercially. He had built Calicut's prosperity deliberately, by welcoming foreign merchants and maintaining a relatively open trading environment. Arab merchants in particular, the Mapila Muslims who had been trading along the Malabar coast for centuries, had deep roots in the city. They were not visitors. They were part of the social and commercial fabric of the place. They had intermarried with local families, built mosques, established trading houses, and developed long-standing relationships with the Zamorin's court. When da Gama arrived, these merchants understood almost immediately what his presence might mean. A direct Portuguese sea route to India would cut them out of the trade entirely. Their alarm was not paranoia, it was accurate. The first landing was strange in a way that would have been almost comical if the stakes had not been so high. When da Gama's men came ashore and were led through the city, they were brought to what they believed was a Christian church. They prayed inside it with apparent sincerity. They were looking at a Hindu temple. The figures they took for saints were Hindu deities. One account describes them kneeling before an image and offering prayers, genuinely believing they had found evidence of a Christian community in India. The confusion is understandable in a limited sense. There were in fact small communities of Christians in Kerala, the St. Thomas Christians, who traced their origins back to the Apostle Thomas himself and had been practicing their faith in India for over 1,000 years. But the building da Gama's men prayed in was not one of theirs. It was a Hindu temple, and the misidentification speaks to how poorly prepared the Portuguese were to understand the world they had just entered. They had sailed 12,000 miles and arrived in a civilization they had almost no framework for interpreting. The diplomatic meetings with the Zamorin were the central challenge of the entire visit, and they did not go well. The Zamorin received da Gama in his palace, and by the standards of the day the audience was a formal one. But the Portuguese were operating at a significant disadvantage almost from the start. The gifts that da Gama had brought to present to the ruler of one of the wealthiest trading cities in Asia were, to put it plainly, embarrassing. The list included striped cloth, scarlet hoods, hats, strings of coral beads, wash basins, sugar, oil, and honey. These were the sorts of goods that might have impressed a minor chieftain along the West African coast, where Portugal had been trading for decades. They were not remotely suitable for a king who received merchants from across the known world, and whose court was accustomed to silks, gold, and fine metalwork. The Zamorins' officials reportedly laughed when the gifts were presented. The Arab merchants present made sure the Zamorin understood that even the poorest merchants from their world brought more impressive offerings than this. It was a diplomatic humiliation, and it coloured everything that followed. Da Gama himself was not a man who responded well to being made to feel small. The accounts of his character that survive are fairly consistent. He was determined, physically brave, capable of genuine cruelty when he felt it was necessary, and possessed of a pride that did not bend easily. He had crossed 2 oceans to get here. He was representing the King of Portugal. Being laughed at by court officials in a foreign city was not something he absorbed gracefully. The negotiations that followed were tense and slow. The Zamorin wanted to understand what exactly the Portuguese were proposing. Were they merchants? Were they diplomats? What did Portugal want, and what could it offer in return? Da Gama struggled to answer these questions convincingly, partly because Portugal had not yet developed a clear policy for what a trading relationship with India would actually look like, and partly because the Arab merchants in the city were actively working against him. The Mapila merchants had every reason to sabotage the negotiations, and they were effective at it. They told the Zamorin that the Portuguese were pirates, not merchants. They pointed out that the goods Da Gama had brought were of poor quality and low value. They suggested that allowing the Portuguese to establish any kind of trading presence in Calicut would bring trouble, not profit. Some of this was self-interested exaggeration, but some of it was simply accurate. Portugal was not coming to India to participate politely in an existing trade system. It was coming to dominate one. The Arab merchants understood this better than the Zamorin did at that point, because they had more experience with European commercial ambitions along the African coast, and because they could read the size and armament of Da Gama's ships more clearly than the Zamorin's court officials could. Da Gama managed to conduct some trading during his weeks in Calicut, but it was limited and unsatisfying. He was able to acquire some pepper and cinnamon, along with a small quantity of other spices and precious stones, but the volume was nothing like what he had hoped for. The Zamorin did not grant him the formal trade agreement he wanted. There was no signed treaty, no established Portuguese trading post, no official recognition of Portugal as a preferred trading partner. What Da Gama got was a letter from the Zamorin to King Manuel I, which was polite in tone but vague in content, and which some historians have described as essentially a non-committal acknowledgement that the Portuguese had shown up rather than a genuine opening of diplomatic relations. The situation deteriorated further in the final days before departure. Da Gama, frustrated by the lack of progress and increasingly suspicious of the Arab merchants' influence over the Zamorin's court, began to behave in ways that made his host deeply uneasy. He delayed his departure repeatedly. He was at one point effectively detained by the Zamorin's officials, who wanted assurances about payment and the return of goods. There were tense standoffs, accusations, and at least one episode where Da Gama was essentially held under a form of house arrest, while negotiations continued. When he finally prepared to leave, he took a number of people aboard his ships without the Zamorin's permission. Some accounts describe them as hostages, others as individuals who had agreed to come voluntarily, but the distinction was probably not very clear to the people involved. He also took several fishing boats and their crews at one point, apparently to ensure his safe passage out of the harbour. It is worth pausing on all of this for a moment, because the standard telling of Da Gama's arrival in India tends to emphasise the achievement of getting there and to pass fairly quickly over what actually happened once he arrived. But what happened was revealing. Da Gama had crossed the Indian Ocean and reached one of the great trading cities of the world, and he had failed to establish a trade agreement, had embarrassed himself with inadequate gifts, had been outmanoeuvred diplomatically by resident Arab merchants, had made enemies of his hosts, and had left under circumstances that were somewhere between a tense withdrawal and a minor standoff. He was bringing back proof that the sea route worked, and a cargo of spices that would make the voyage profitable, but he was not bringing back a commercial treaty or a warm invitation to return. The Zamorin, for his part, seems to have viewed the whole episode with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. The Portuguese were clearly not merchants in the ordinary sense. They had strange ships, strange weapons, strange manners, and an attitude that did not quite fit the established protocols of the Indian Ocean trade world. They were also, from the Zamorin's perspective, a minor nuisance compared to the established Arab trading networks that kept his city wealthy. He had no particular reason to favour them over partners he had worked with for generations. What he could not have known, and what no one in Calicut could have known in the summer of 1498, was that these strange visitors from the far edge of the Atlantic were not going to go away. They were the beginning of something. Not a trading partnership, as it turned out, but an intrusion. The fleet left Calicut in late August 1498, carrying its modest cargo of spices, its letter from the Zamorin, its hostages, and the knowledge that the route had been completed. The Indian Ocean crossing had been achieved. The city had been reached. Trade of a sort had taken place. By the metrics that King Manuel I cared about most, the voyage was a success. The route existed. The spices were real. The sea between Portugal and India could be navigated. Everything else, the diplomatic failures, the inadequate gifts, the tense departure, the hostages, those were problems for the next voyage to sort out. And there would be a next voyage. There would be many next voyages. The awkward, difficult, occasionally farcical encounter between da Gama's small fleet and the sophisticated city of Calicut was not the end of the story. It was, in a sense, the first rough draft of a relationship that would become increasingly violent, increasingly consequential, and increasingly difficult to contain. The Arab merchants who had worked so hard to undermine da Gama's negotiations were right to be worried. The Portuguese were not going to accept a polite rejection and sail home permanently. They were going to come back with more ships, more weapons, and a very different approach to the question of who controlled the spice trade. But that was still ahead. For now, the fleet was at sea again, heading back the way it had come, carrying its cargo and its exhausted crew out of the harbour at Calicut and into the Indian Ocean. The crossing home was waiting, and the crossing home, as it turned out, was going to be far worse than anything the outward journey had prepared them for. They had the spices, they had the route, they had a letter from the Zamorin that was polite if not particularly meaningful. By the measures that mattered to Lisbon, the voyage had accomplished what it set out to do, but the Indian Ocean does not care about what has been accomplished. It only cares about wind and season. And the wind, in late August of 1498, was entirely the wrong direction. When Ahmad ibn Majid, or whoever the pilot actually was, had guided the fleet eastward from Malindi in April, he had done so with the southwest monsoon filling the sails behind them. The monsoon system of the Indian Ocean is one of the most reliable meteorological patterns on Earth. It reverses itself twice a year with extraordinary consistency. From roughly April through September, the winds blow from the southwest, pushing ships northeast toward India. From roughly October through March, they reverse and blow from the northeast, pushing ships back toward Africa. Arab and Indian sailors had understood this system for centuries, perhaps millennia. They built their entire trading calendar around it. You sailed east in one season and west in the other, and you timed your departures accordingly. Da Gama left Calicut in late August. The southwest monsoon was already weakening. The northeast monsoon had not yet established itself. The fleet was sailing into a meteorological in-between zone, a period when the winds are inconsistent, the weather is unpredictable, and the sea offers no reliable assistance in any direction. The crossing from Malindi to Calicut had taken 23 days. The return crossing took nearly 3 months. 3 months on the open Indian Ocean, in wooden ships, with limited food, with water that had been stored in barrels for far too long, with a crew that was already exhausted from over a year at sea. The numbers are hard to fully absorb. The outward crossing had been demanding but manageable. The return crossing was something else entirely. It was a slow, grinding ordeal that tested every man aboard in ways that the storms off the Cape of Good Hope had not. The disease that took the most men was scurvy. It is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, though da Gama and his crew had no way of knowing that. What they experienced was the visible progression of the illness, which is deeply unpleasant to describe and was deeply unpleasant to endure. It begins with fatigue and weakness. Then the gums start to swell and soften. They become spongy, almost pulpy, and they bleed easily. Old wounds that had healed months earlier can reopen, as if the body is slowly unknitting itself. The legs swell and ache, the joints become painful, teeth loosen and fall out. Men who had been strong and capable at the start of the voyage found themselves unable to stand, unable to work, unable to eat. And then, if nothing changed, they died. There was no cure available to the fleet. There were no citrus fruits aboard in any useful quantity. There were no fresh vegetables, no leafy greens. Nothing that would have interrupted the deficiency. The men ate what they had, which was mostly salted meat, hardtack, dried fish, and whatever else had survived the months in the hold. None of it helped. The illness moved through the crew steadily, and there was nothing da Gama or his officers could do except watch and wait, and hope that land came soon enough. One account from the voyage, attributed to an anonymous Portuguese crew member whose journal has survived in various forms, describes the scene on the ships during this crossing in terms that are genuinely difficult to read. The men were too sick to work the sails properly. The healthy men, and there were fewer and fewer of them as the weeks passed, were being asked to do the work of 3 or 4. Da Gama himself reportedly fell ill at some point during the crossing, though he recovered. Others did not. Men who had survived the Atlantic, the Cape, the East African coast, and the crossing to India, men who had made it all the way to Calicut and back, died on the return voyage within sight of completing the journey. The sea does not award points for distance travelled. By the accounts that have survived, somewhere between 20 and 30 men died during the return crossing of the Indian Ocean alone. The exact number is uncertain. Record keeping under those conditions was not meticulous, but the scale of the loss was significant. When the fleet finally reached the East African coast and made landfall near Malindi in early January of 1499, they had been at sea for roughly 90 days since leaving Calicut. They were depleted, ill, and reduced in number in ways that created an immediate practical problem. Da Gama had set out with 4 ships. The supply ship had been burned at sea months earlier, on the outward journey, after its supplies were transferred and the crew was distributed among the remaining 3 vessels. That was planned. But now, arriving on the African coast with a crew that had been devastated by scurvy and the crossing, da Gama faced a calculation he had probably hoped to avoid. He did not have enough men left to sail 3 ships. The São Rafael was the ship he chose to sacrifice. It was one of the 2 larger vessels, the sister ship of the São Gabriel, which da Gama commanded. The decision to burn it was pragmatic rather than sentimental. The crew was consolidated onto the São Gabriel and the smaller Berrio, and the São Rafael was stripped of anything useful, then set alight. It burned on the East African coast somewhere near the Mozambique Channel. João de Sá, who had commanded it, watched his ship burn from the deck of another vessel. The men who had sailed it were now distributed among the surviving ships, filling roles left empty by the dead. They stopped at Malindi again, where the Sultan had been friendly on the outward journey. The rest was welcome and necessary. Fresh food, fresh water, time ashore. For men who had spent months at sea eating from barrels, the availability of fresh fruit and meat must have felt almost medicinal. Scurvy responds quickly to vitamin C, and men who had been barely functional could recover surprising amounts of strength within days of eating fresh food. The stop at Malindi was not long, but it was restorative in ways that probably saved additional lives. From Malindi, the 2 remaining ships moved south along the East African coast, retracing the route they had taken northward nearly a year before. The Swahili ports, the Mozambique Channel, the southern coast of Africa stretching toward the Cape. The Cape of Good Hope was still ahead of them, and rounding it on the return journey was no easier than it had been on the way out. The storms in those waters are not seasonal in the way the monsoon is. They arrive when they choose. The fleet battled difficult weather again as they worked around the southern tip of Africa and into the Atlantic. The Atlantic, after everything, must have felt almost familiar. The cold gave way to warmth as they moved northward. The stars shifted back toward patterns that European sailors recognised. The coast of West Africa appeared to their east. They were heading home, and the fact of it, after more than a year and a half at sea, must have been both profound and strangely difficult to fully believe. But the voyage's toll was not finished. Da Gama's brother Paulo, who had commanded the San Rafael before it was burned and who had been with the expedition from the beginning, was gravely ill. He had been sick for some time, and his condition worsened as the fleet moved north through the Atlantic. When they reached the Cape Verde Islands, it became clear that Paulo was dying. Da Gama made the decision to stop. He transferred to a faster vessel, a hired ship, and took his brother to the Azores, hoping that rest ashore and whatever care could be found there might help him recover. Paulo da Gama died in the Azores. He did not make it back to Portugal. Da Gama stayed long enough to bury him before sailing on to Lisbon. Meanwhile, the Berrio, the smallest of the original 4 ships, had pressed ahead without waiting. It arrived in Portugal in July of 1499, more than 2 years after the fleet had departed. Nicola Coelho, who commanded it, was the first to bring the news back to Lisbon. The sea route to India was real. The voyage had been completed. The spices were aboard. Da Gama arrived in Lisbon in September 1499, 2 months after the Berrio, delayed by his brother's death in the Azores. He came back to a city that was already celebrating. King Manuel I had received Coelho's news and understood immediately what it meant. The reception Da Gama received was that of a man who had done something genuinely extraordinary. There were ceremonies, honours, titles. Manuel I styled himself Lord of the Conquest, Navigation and Commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia and India. A title that was somewhat ambitious given that he had sent 4 ships and received a vague letter from a king who was not particularly impressed. But ambition has never required perfect accuracy to function. The human cost of the voyage was staggering by any honest accounting. Of the roughly 170 men who had sailed from Lisbon in July of 1497, fewer than 60 returned. The exact number varies depending on the source, but the general shape of it is consistent. More than half the crew was dead. 2 of the 4 ships were gone. The men who did come back were not the same men who had left. They had spent 2 years at sea, survived storms, disease, violence, and the slow grinding attrition of a voyage that pushed every limit of what wooden ships and human bodies could endure. What they brought back was modest in volume, but extraordinary in value. The cargo included pepper, the most commercially important spice in European trade. It included cinnamon, cloves, and a quantity of precious stones. The precise value of the cargo has been estimated differently by different historians, but the general consensus is that it was worth several times the cost of the expedition. Some accounts suggest it was worth as much as 60 times the cost, though that figure may be on the high end. Even at a more conservative estimate, the profit was substantial, enough to prove the point, enough to justify the investment, enough to make every merchant in Lisbon and every court in Europe pay very close attention. Because that was what the voyage had actually delivered. Beyond the spices, beyond the letter from the Zamorin, beyond the ceremony and the titles, it had delivered proof. Proof that a ship could leave Lisbon, sail around Africa, cross the Indian Ocean, reach India, load a cargo of spices and return. The route worked. The distance was enormous and the cost in lives was terrible, but the route worked. And once something has been proven possible, the question shifts immediately from whether it can be done to how to do it better, faster, more profitably, and with more ships. Portugal did not pause long to reflect on the dead. There was too much to plan. The second voyage to India was already being organised before da Gama had fully recovered from the first. The world that the fleet had sailed into was not going to wait, and neither was Lisbon. The route had been opened. Now it needed to be exploited, and the men who would do that exploiting were already preparing their ships, loading their supplies, and thinking about what da Gama had learned, what he had done wrong, and what they would do differently when they arrived in Calicut and found the Arab merchants still there, still influential, and still very much opposed to a Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean trade. What followed da Gama's return was not a quiet diplomatic effort to build on the fragile contacts he had made. It was something considerably more forceful and considerably more consequential for everyone involved. The Berrio slipped into the Tagus River in July of 1499 with a small crew, a hold carrying spices, and a story that Nicolau Coelho could barely have found the words for. The ship was battered. The men aboard were thin, weathered, changed in ways that probably did not fully show until later, when the initial rush of arrival had settled and they tried to explain to people on shore what 2 years at sea actually felt like. Coelho brought the news to King Manuel I directly. The route was real. India had been reached. The fleet was on its way home. Lisbon absorbed this information like dry ground absorbing rain. It happened quickly, and the effect spread outward in every direction almost immediately. Da Gama arrived 2 months later in September, delayed by his brother's death in the Azores. By the time he sailed into Lisbon, the city had already had weeks to begin processing what the voyage meant. Manuel had already begun composing letters to other European rulers announcing the achievement. The celebration that greeted da Gama was genuine and loud, the kind of public reception that a city gives to a man who has confirmed something it desperately needed confirmed. There were processions, prayers, ceremonies at the waterfront. Da Gama was received at court with the kind of treatment reserved for men who had fundamentally altered the position of a kingdom in the world. Manuel granted him the title Admiral of the Indian Ocean, a title that had not existed before and had to be invented to fit the occasion. He received a substantial pension and the rights to certain revenues from the India trade. He was, by any measure, a celebrated man. And yet da Gama had buried his brother in the Azores 2 weeks before. He had watched more than 100 men die over the course of the voyage. He had come home to a city celebrating something that had cost an enormous amount of human life to produce. Whether he felt the weight of that alongside the honours, we cannot know with any certainty. The historical record tells us what he received. It does not tell us what he felt standing in Lisbon again after 2 years away, with Paulo gone and the faces of dead crewmen presumably somewhere in his memory. The human cost deserves to be looked at plainly, without softening it. Of the approximately 170 men who had sailed from Restelo in July of 1497, somewhere between 50 and 60 returned. The numbers vary slightly depending on the source, but the shape of the loss is consistent across accounts. More than half the people who left did not come back. 2 ships were gone. The San Rafael had been burned on the African coast because there were not enough surviving crew members to sail it. The supply ship had been scuttled earlier in the voyage. Of the original 4 ships, only the Berrio and the San Gabriel made it home, and even those vessels were in poor condition after the journey. The men who died had not all died in dramatic moments. Some were killed in the skirmishes along the East African coast. Some died during the brutal return crossing of the Indian Ocean, when scurvy and exhaustion and the sheer length of the journey against the monsoon took people week by week. Others died of illness during the long haul up the African coast after the Cape. Paulo da Gama, who had commanded a ship and who was by all accounts close to his brother, died in the Azores before he could see Portugal again. The voyage consumed people steadily, from beginning to end, in the way that long ocean passages in wooden ships without adequate nutrition or medicine always did. What came back in the holds of the surviving ships was, by the standards of what had been spent in lives and money and time, a relatively modest physical quantity. The cargo included black pepper, which was the most commercially significant spice in European trade at the time, and which could be bought cheaply in Calicut and sold for a very high price in Lisbon. There was cinnamon, which came primarily from the island of Ceylon and was present in the Indian spice markets. There were cloves, which were produced mainly in the Moluccas and traded through Calicut. There was some ginger, some precious stones, and a small quantity of other goods. The total volume was not enormous. The fleet had not managed to fill its holds the way a well-established trading mission might have done. The negotiations in Calicut had been too difficult, the time too short, the departure too abrupt. But the value was extraordinary relative to the cost of the expedition. Estimates of the profit margin vary considerably among historians, and the exact figures depend on how one calculates the cost of the fleet and what prices the spices commanded on the Lisbon market. Some accounts from the period suggest returns of 30 or 40 times the cost of the expedition. More conservative modern estimates tend to be lower, but even at those lower figures, the cargo paid for the voyage many times over. Pepper alone was selling in Lisbon at prices that reflected its status as a luxury good, one that had previously passed through many hands and accumulated cost at every stage of its journey, from the Malabar coast through Arab intermediaries and overland routes and Venetian merchants before it reached a European kitchen. Da Gama had eliminated all of those intermediaries in a single voyage. The pepper in his hold had gone directly from India to Portugal by sea, and the difference in cost was enormous. This was the point that mattered most to Manuel and to the merchants and investors who had funded the expedition. The voyage had not just succeeded in a navigational sense, it had demonstrated a commercial logic that was almost too good to be disbelieved. If one voyage with 4 ships, even a voyage that lost more than half its crew and came back with a modest cargo, could return a profit of that scale, then what would a larger fleet accomplish? What would regular voyages accomplish? What would a permanent trading presence in India accomplish? The questions answered themselves, and the answers all pointed in the same direction. Manuel moved quickly. He was not a man inclined to wait while opportunity organised itself. The second India voyage was authorised almost immediately, and its scale reflected the ambition that the first voyage had unlocked. Where Da Gama had sailed with 4 ships and roughly 170 men, the second expedition would be far larger. The planning began while Da Gama was still recovering from the first voyage, and the man chosen to lead it was Pedro Álvares Cabral, a Portuguese nobleman with naval experience but without Da Gama's specific knowledge of the route. 13 ships, several hundred men. A fleet of a size that made the first expedition look like a reconnaissance mission, which in many ways it had been. The political meaning of the voyage extended well beyond Portugal's borders. Manuel's announcement letters went to the Spanish monarchs, to the Pope, to other European rulers. The tone of those letters was triumphant and deliberately so. Portugal had done something no other European power had done. It had found the sea route to India. It had made contact with the source of the spice trade. It had bypassed the Ottoman Empire's control of the overland routes, bypassed the Arab intermediaries, bypassed the Venetian merchants who had for generations profited from their position at the western end of the spice chain. All of that was now, in theory, obsolete. Portugal could trade directly with India by sea, and no other European nation yet had the knowledge or the infrastructure to do the same. Venice understood the implications almost immediately. The Venetian merchant and diplomat Girolamo Priuli wrote in his diary around 1501 that the news from Portugal was the worst he had ever heard, that it would ruin the spice trade that Venice depended on, that the Portuguese route would draw commerce away from the eastern Mediterranean and the overland routes toward the Atlantic. He was not wrong, though the shift took longer and was messier than a clean economic analysis might suggest. Trade routes do not redirect overnight. The Arab merchants who controlled the Indian Ocean trade were not going to step aside politely. The Zamorin of Calicut was not going to welcome Portuguese ships, simply because they had arrived once and returned home. The world that Da Gama's voyage had opened was not an empty world waiting for Portugal to fill it. It was a world full of existing interests, existing powers, and existing people who had their own views about whether Portuguese ships belonged in the Indian Ocean at all. But in Lisbon in the autumn of 1499, all of that complexity was still ahead. What the city had in that moment was the fact of the voyage and the proof of the route. Da Gama had sailed from Portugal to India and back. He had done it with 4 ships, without reliable charts for most of the journey, without any guarantee that the Indian Ocean could be crossed from the African coast, and without any certainty that India's rulers would receive him at all. He had managed the crossing, managed the politics in Calicut as well as the situation allowed, and brought the fleet home with cargo and knowledge and a letter from the Zamorin that, however cool in its tone, at least acknowledged that contact had been made. The route was proven, the distance was known, the monsoon winds were understood, the stops along the African coast were mapped. The next voyage would have all of that information to work with, and it would have 13 ships instead of 4. What Da Gama himself thought about what came next is harder to say. He was given his titles and his pension, and his place in the court's esteem, and he largely stepped back from active command for several years after the first voyage. He married, settled into a life appropriate to his new status, and watched from a distance as the consequences of what he had done began to unfold across the Indian Ocean world. He was not a man who left behind a great deal of personal writing. The historical record gives us his actions more than his thoughts. What we know is that he had proven something that Portugal needed proven, and that the proving of it had cost a very great deal, and that the world was already moving on to what came next before the survivors had fully rested. The spices from the first voyage were sold, the money was noted, the plans for the second voyage moved forward, and somewhere in the accounting of that moment, if one looked carefully, was the beginning of something much larger than a single successful navigation. The route from Lisbon to Calicut was now a fact, and facts of that kind, once established, tend to attract ships, money, ambition, and force in roughly that order. The second India voyage would carry all 4 of those things in quantities that the first voyage had only hinted at, and what happened when that fleet arrived in Calicut would make Da Gama's careful, difficult, inconclusive negotiations look almost gentle by comparison. Pedro Álvares Cabral's fleet left Lisbon in March of 1500. 13 ships, a crew numbering somewhere around 1,000 men, and instructions that made it clear this was not merely a trading expedition. It was a demonstration. Portugal intended to establish a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean, to negotiate where possible, and to use force where necessary. The fleet carried diplomats, priests, soldiers, and enough artillery to make the diplomacy feel more persuasive. What happened on the way to India was not in the plan. Following Da Gama's advice to swing wide into the Atlantic to catch the best winds, Cabral's fleet swung perhaps a little too wide, or perhaps exactly as intended depending on which historian one asks, and in late April 1500 the lookout spotted land to the west. Green hills, long beaches, unfamiliar birds. They had reached the coast of what is now Brazil. Cabral spent about 10 days there, claimed the land for Portugal, sent a ship back to Lisbon with the news, and continued east toward the Cape of Good Hope. The discovery of Brazil was almost a footnote to the main mission. Almost. It would eventually become rather more significant than that, but in the spring of 1500, Cabral had other things on his mind. The voyage around the Cape cost him 4 ships in a single storm. Among the men lost was Bartolomeu Dias, the man who had first rounded that cape 12 years earlier, and who had joined Cabral's fleet as far as the African coast. There is something quietly heavy about that. Dias had spent his career pushing south along Africa, had been the one to prove the Cape could be rounded, had watched Da Gama depart on a voyage he himself had made possible, and then died in the waters he had spent his life reaching. The sea does not keep score in any way that feels fair. Cabral arrived in Calicut in September 1500. The reception was cooler than he had hoped. The Arab merchants who controlled much of Calicut's trade had not forgotten Da Gama's visit, and they had not become more welcoming in the intervening 2 years. There were negotiations, partial agreements, and a small Portuguese trading post, a feitoria, was established in the city. Cabral left some men there and continued down the coast to trade at other ports. Then the news came back. The trading post in Calicut had been attacked. The Portuguese men left there had been killed, somewhere between 50 and 70 of them, depending on the source. Their goods had been seized. Whether this was organised by the Zamorin, encouraged by the Arab merchants, or a more spontaneous act of violence is not entirely clear from the historical record. What is clear is what Cabral did in response. He bombarded Calicut. For 2 days, Portuguese guns fired on the city. Ships in the harbour were seized and burned. Cabral then sailed down the coast to Cochin and Cananor, where local rulers were more willing to trade with him, partly because they had their own tensions with Calicut and saw the Portuguese as a useful counterweight. He loaded his remaining ships with spices and sailed for home. The voyage had been violent, costly, and in commercial terms still profitable. The pepper and cinnamon he brought back more than covered the losses. That calculation, brutal as it sounds, was the one that mattered most in Lisbon. And then, in 1502, Vasco da Gama went back. His second voyage was different in character from the first in almost every way that mattered. The first voyage had been exploratory. Da Gama had been navigating unknown waters, making contact with unknown rulers, trying to establish whether the route was viable and whether trade was possible. He had been cautious, calculating, sometimes deceptive, but broadly trying to negotiate his way through a world he did not yet understand. The second voyage had no such uncertainty. Da Gama knew the route. He knew the ports. He knew the political landscape. He knew who had been trading in these waters for centuries and who now stood in Portugal's way. He sailed with 20 ships, later reinforced by more, and he sailed with a clear mandate from King Manuel to establish Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean by whatever means were required. What followed was not diplomacy. Off the coast of India, Da Gama's fleet intercepted a large Arab merchant ship called the Miri. The ship was returning from Mecca and carried several hundred pilgrims. Estimates range from around 400 to perhaps more, men, women, and children. It also carried a cargo of considerable value. Da Gama had the cargo transferred to his own ships. Then he ordered the Miri sealed and set on fire. The passengers and crew were locked inside. Some accounts say that when people tried to escape through portholes or by jumping into the water, Portuguese sailors drove them back with pikes and lances. The ship burned for several days before it finally sank. There were almost no survivors. This was not a battle. It was not a military engagement. It was the deliberate killing of civilians, pilgrims returning from Mecca on a merchant vessel. Contemporary Portuguese sources record it. Later historians have written about it extensively. It is not a disputed event. What drove Da Gama to do it is a question historians have debated. Some argue it was a calculated act of terror, intended to send a message to the Muslim trading networks of the Indian Ocean that Portugal was now a power to be reckoned with and feared. Some argue it reflected a deep personal hostility toward Islam that Da Gama carried throughout his life. Some argue it was simply the logic of a man who had been given unlimited authority in a distant ocean, and who had decided that the fastest way to establish control was through overwhelming violence. Probably all three things were true at once. The burning of the Miri was the most extreme act of Da Gama's second voyage, but it was not an isolated one. He bombarded Calicut again, more extensively than Cabral had. He hanged captured sailors and fishermen and had their bodies sent ashore as a message. He cut off the hands and ears and noses of prisoners and sent them to the Zamorin in a boat, with a note suggesting the Zamorin used these pieces to make a curry. This is recorded in the accounts of the voyage. It is not folklore. Da Gama operated in the Indian Ocean in 1502 and 1503, with a brutality that went beyond what even the violent logic of the era required. The strategic result, however, was real. By the end of the second voyage, Portuguese trading posts had been established or reinforced at Cochin, Cananor, and other points along the Malabar coast. Ships from Lisbon now had reliable stopping points, friendly rulers who had been persuaded or pressured into agreements, and a demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who resisted. The Arab merchants who had dominated Indian Ocean trade for centuries could not match Portuguese naval firepower. Their dhows were fast and manoeuvrable, well suited for the trading routes they had sailed for generations, but they were not built for cannon warfare. The Portuguese caravel and carrack with their heavy guns changed the terms of engagement in waters where naval combat had previously been very different in character. The Estado da India, the Portuguese state of India, began to take shape in these years. It was not a land empire in the way that later European colonial projects would become. Portugal did not have the population or the resources to conquer and administer vast territories in Asia. What it built instead was a network of fortified trading posts, coastal strongholds, and naval checkpoints. Goa, seized in 1510 by Afonso de Albuquerque, became the administrative centre of this network. Malacca on the Malay Peninsula was taken in 1511, giving Portugal control of the narrow strait through which much of the trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea had to pass. Hormuz, at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, was taken in 1515. The network was built around control of choke points, the narrow passages and key ports through which trade had to flow, rather than around the conquest of interior territories. The disruption to the existing trade systems was enormous. Arab merchants who had carried spices from India to the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, from where they were distributed to Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and eventually to Venice and the rest of Europe, found their routes increasingly dangerous and their profits increasingly squeezed. Portuguese ships patrolled the Indian Ocean and demanded that merchant vessels carry a cartaz, a Portuguese-issued pass, or risk being attacked. It was, in essence, a protection racket backed by naval force, and it worked. Not perfectly, not completely, and not without constant resistance, but it worked well enough to redirect a meaningful portion of the spice trade toward the Portuguese Atlantic route. Venice felt it. The Venetian spice trade, which had been one of the foundations of the city's extraordinary wealth, declined sharply in the early 16th century. Girolamo Priuli had been right in his diary entry of 1501. The Portuguese route was pulling commerce away from the eastern Mediterranean. Venetian merchants tried various responses, including lobbying the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and later the Ottoman Empire to challenge Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean. There were naval engagements. There were diplomatic efforts. But the fundamental problem was geographic. The Atlantic route to India was simply more direct for European buyers than the overland and Red Sea routes. And once Portugal had made it work and made it safe enough for regular voyages, the economics were difficult to argue with. None of this unfolded cleanly or quickly. The Portuguese network was constantly under pressure. Local rulers who had initially cooperated sometimes changed their minds. Arab merchants found ways around the cartaz system. The Zamorin of Calicut never fully submitted and continued to resist Portuguese influence for decades. Maintaining fortresses and garrisons in Goa and Malacca and Hormuz required continuous resources, continuous reinforcement, and continuous fighting. The Estado da India was not a stable empire. It was more like a permanent state of armed commercial competition, expensive to maintain and often violent in its day-to-day operation. But it existed, it functioned, and its existence was traceable in a direct line back to the 4 ships that had left Lisbon in July of 1497 with a crew of roughly 170 men and instructions to find the sea route to India. What da Gama had proven on that first voyage, what the second voyage had turned from proof into policy, was now becoming a permanent feature of the world's commercial geography. The Indian Ocean, which had been an Arab and Indian and Chinese sea for centuries, which had carried the wealth of the spice trade along routes that European merchants could only access at the far end through expensive intermediaries, was now contested by a European naval power with guns, fortresses and a king in Lisbon who decided that the ocean belonged to Portugal. The people who lived and traded in the Indian Ocean world had not been consulted about this decision. The Zamorin of Calicut, the Sultan of Malindi who had helped da Gama in the first place, the Arab pilots and merchants who had navigated these waters for generations, the traders of Malacca, and the farmers of the Malabar coast who grew the pepper and the cinnamon, None of them had asked for Portuguese ships to appear in their waters and begin demanding passes and bombarding cities and burning pilgrim ships. The violence of the second voyage and of the Estado da India that followed was not incidental to the project. It was structural. The whole enterprise rested on the ability to destroy anyone who refused to cooperate, and that ability was used regularly. What da Gama had opened in 1498 was not simply a trade route. It was the beginning of a particular kind of European relationship with Asia, one based on naval superiority, forced commerce, and the willingness to use extreme violence to protect commercial interests. The Portuguese were the first, but they would not be the last. The Dutch, the English and others would follow the same route, build similar networks and deploy similar logic. Da Gama's voyage was the first chapter of a very long story, and the chapters that followed it were not gentle ones. For now, though, the immediate shape of what the voyage had unleashed was becoming clear. The spice trade was being redirected. The Arab intermediaries were being displaced by force. Portuguese fortresses were rising on coasts that had never seen a European flag. And in Lisbon, the wealth flowing back from the Indian Ocean was funding churches, monasteries, art, and the further expansion of Portuguese maritime ambition. The Jerónimos monastery, built partly with profits from the spice trade, was rising in the same neighbourhood from which da Gama had departed in 1497. The city was being remade by the consequences of the voyage, and those consequences were still accumulating, still spreading outward across the Indian Ocean world and back into Europe, still reshaping the trade routes that determined who was wealthy and who was not. The full weight of what had been set in motion was only beginning to be felt, and the man who had started it was watching from a distance, his titles and his pension secured, his place in history already fixed, while the world he had opened continued to change in ways that even he could not entirely have predicted. So what did the voyage actually change? Not in the immediate years, not just in the ledgers of Lisbon merchants or the complaints of Venetian traders, but in the longer shape of the world. That is the question worth sitting with for a moment, because the answer is genuinely large, and it deserves more than a quick summary. The most visible shift was geographic, or really economic geographic. Before da Gama, the spice trade moved along a web of overland and coastal routes that ran from the Malabar coast of India westward through the Arabian Sea, into the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, across to Egypt or Mesopotamia, and from there into the Mediterranean world where Venetian and Genoese merchants picked it up and carried it to the rest of Europe. This system had been in place for centuries. It was old, it was deep, it was profitable for everyone who touched it along the way, and it was essentially invisible to ordinary Europeans who simply knew that spices were expensive and left it at that. After da Gama, that web began to fray, not overnight, not completely. But the direction of change was clear from very early on, and it only accelerated as the 16th century progressed. The Atlantic route was longer in raw distance, but it cut out almost every intermediary. A Portuguese ship that loaded pepper in Calicut and sailed it directly to Lisbon was bypassing the Arab merchants of the Indian Ocean, the Egyptian traders of the Red Sea, the Ottoman customs officials, the Venetian distributors, and everyone else who had previously taken a share of the price between the pepper farmer in Kerala and the cook in a Flemish kitchen. That compression of the supply chain was worth an enormous amount of money, and it meant that Portugal could sell spices in Europe at prices that undercut the traditional Mediterranean trade, even while still making spectacular profits. The mathematics of the route were simply better once the route could be sailed reliably, and Portugal worked hard and ruthlessly to make sure it could. Lisbon transformed. The city had been a modest Atlantic port, important within Portugal, but not a major centre of European commerce. Within a generation of da Gama's first voyage, it was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. Ships from across the continent came to Lisbon to buy spices. The Portuguese crown collected taxes on every transaction. The Rua Nova dos Mercadores, the main commercial street, was reportedly lined with merchants from Italy, Flanders, Germany, and England. The wealth flowing through the city was visible in stone, in the great buildings being raised with spice money, in the ships being built, in the art being commissioned. Lisbon had been remade by a sea route that had not existed 20 years earlier. Venice, meanwhile, was trying to adjust to a world that had shifted beneath it. The city did not collapse, and the Mediterranean trade did not simply stop. But the Venetian spice trade declined substantially in the first decades of the 16th century, and the city's political and financial position in Europe weakened as a result. Venice was still Venice, still beautiful, still powerful, still important. But it was no longer the indispensable gateway to Eastern goods that it had been for so long. The spices were going around it now, arriving in Lisbon and then moving north and east through different channels. The pivot point of European commerce had shifted westward, toward the Atlantic, and that shift would only deepen as the century continued, and as other Atlantic powers began to build their own oceanic networks. This westward pivot was not just about spices, it was about what kind of world was being built. The Portuguese route to India was one of two great oceanic openings that happened within a few years of each other. Columbus had reached the Americas in 1492, 5 years before da Gama reached India. Together, these two voyages announced something new, that European powers were going to expand outward along oceanic routes, and that the Atlantic was going to become the central highway of a new kind of global commerce. The world was being reoriented around the ocean rather than around the Mediterranean and the Silk Road. That reorientation took decades to fully register, and it took centuries to work through all its consequences, but the direction was set in those years around the turn of the 16th century, and da Gama's voyage was one of the two pivots on which it turned. The comparison to Columbus is useful but imperfect. Both voyages opened new oceanic connections. Both were driven by the desire to reach the spice trade. Both were backed by Iberian crowns and carried out by men willing to sail into genuinely unknown conditions. But the worlds they opened were very different. Columbus reached a hemisphere that was, from the European perspective, entirely new, populated by peoples who had no prior contact with Europe, Asia or Africa. Da Gama reached a world that was already deeply connected, already wealthy, already sophisticated, already trading with Arabia and Persia and China and East Africa. The Indian Ocean was not a blank space. It had its own history, its own networks, its own centres of power. The Portuguese were arriving as uninvited competitors in a system that was already functioning perfectly well without them. This distinction matters when thinking about what the voyage changed for the people who were already there. The Columbian Exchange, as historians call the transfer of plants, animals, diseases and peoples between the Old World and the New, was catastrophic for the indigenous populations of the Americas in ways that are almost impossible to fully describe. The Indian Ocean world was not hitting quite the same way, because it was not isolated from Old World diseases. But the disruption caused by the Portuguese arrival was still severe and lasting. Trade routes that had supported cities and communities for generations were forcibly altered. Merchants who had carried goods peacefully for centuries found themselves subject to armed inspection, taxation, and attack. The cartas system was not just an inconvenience. For many small traders, it was ruin. For the port cities that refused to cooperate with Portuguese demands, it could mean bombardment. The city of Calicut, which da Gama had first visited in 1498, spent the following decades in a state of near-constant conflict with the Portuguese. The Zamorin formed alliances with Arab merchants and with other regional powers to resist Portuguese dominance. There were naval battles, there were sieges. The city was bombarded more than once. It never became a Portuguese possession, which was itself a kind of testimony to the limits of Portuguese power, but it paid a heavy price for its resistance. The trade that had made Calicut wealthy was disrupted and redirected. The Arab merchants who had been the city's commercial partners were targeted by Portuguese ships. The cosmopolitan, pluralistic trading world of the Malabar coast was not destroyed, but it was damaged, and the damage accumulated over decades. Goa tells a different story. The the Portuguese captured Goa in 1510, 2 years after da Gama's second voyage, under the command of Afonso de Albuquerque. It became the capital of the Estado da India and remained a Portuguese possession for an extraordinary length of time until 1961, when the Indian government finally reclaimed it by military force. For 4.5 centuries, Goa was a piece of Portugal on the Indian coast, a place where the consequences of da Gama's voyage were literally built into the landscape in the form of churches, forts, and administrative buildings. The old city of Goa is still there, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its Baroque churches rising improbably from the tropical coast. When you look at those buildings, you're looking at the physical residue of the decision made in Lisbon in 1497 to send 4 ships south around Africa. Malacca, the great trading port at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, fell to the Portuguese in 1511. It had been one of the most important nodes in the Asian spice trade, the place where goods from the Spice Islands, from China, from India, and from the rest of Southeast Asia converged. Its capture gave Portugal a position at the eastern end of the Indian Ocean trade network to match its position at the western end. The Portuguese network now stretched from Lisbon to the Malabar coast to Malacca, to the Spice Islands themselves, the Moluccas, where the cloves and nutmeg that had driven so much of this ambition actually grew. The circuit that Prince Henry's captains had begun tracing along the African coast in the 1420s had now been completed all the way to its source. Historians have spent a great deal of time debating how to weigh all of this. The voyage was unquestionably a turning point in world history. That is not a phrase that gets used carelessly here. The opening of the sea route to India genuinely altered the structure of global trade, shifted the centre of gravity of European commerce from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and initiated a process of European maritime expansion into Asia that would continue for centuries and reshape the political and economic landscape of the entire Indian Ocean world. In terms of its consequences for the direction of history, da Gama's voyage belongs in a very small category of events that actually changed the trajectory of the world, rather than just reflecting changes that were already underway. But the same historians are also careful to note what that turning point meant for the people who were on the receiving end of it. The Estado da India was built on violence. The Cartas system was coercion. The burning of the Miri was a war crime by any reasonable standard. The bombardment of Calicut, the forced displacement of Arab merchants, the capture of Malacca, the extraction of wealth from the Indian Ocean world to fund Portuguese expansion. All of this was part of the same project that began with da Gama's first careful arrival in Calicut harbour in May of 1498. The voyage that is celebrated in Portuguese national memory as a triumph of navigation and courage was experienced by many of the people it affected as the beginning of a long and violent intrusion. Both of these things are true at the same time, and a careful account of the voyage has to hold both without letting one cancel the other. The navigational achievement was real. The courage required to sail those 4 ships around Africa and across the Indian Ocean in 1497 was genuine. The consequences for European commerce were enormous and historically significant, and the consequences for the Indian Ocean world were disruptive, often violent, and in many cases deeply harmful to communities and trade systems that had their own long histories and their own legitimate claims to the waters and the commerce that the Portuguese decided to control. What da Gama started was not just a trade route, it was a template. The Portuguese model of oceanic empire, the combination of naval force, fortified trading posts, monopoly claims over sea routes, and the willingness to use extreme violence against anyone who refused to comply, was studied and imitated by every European maritime power that came after. The Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, the French, the Spanish in the Pacific. All of them built on variations of what Portugal had pioneered. The specific details changed, the flags changed, the languages of the administrators changed, but the underlying structure, a European power using naval superiority to insert itself into existing Asian trade networks and extract wealth on its own terms, was established by Portugal in the decades following da Gama's first voyage, and it became the model for European engagement with Asia for the next 4 centuries. That is a long shadow for 4 small ships to cast, and yet it is accurate. The ships were small, the crew was modest in number. The gifts da Gama brought to the Zamorin were embarrassingly inadequate. The first voyage barely established a commercial foothold. But what it proved, that the route was possible, that the Indian Ocean could be reached and crossed, that the spice trade could be accessed directly was enough. Proof of concept, as we might say today. Once the concept was proven, the resources followed, and the resources were used in ways that went far beyond anything the first voyage had achieved or intended. The world that emerged from da Gama's voyage was wealthier for some and poorer for others, more connected in some ways and more violently divided in others. The spices reached European tables more cheaply than before, which is a genuinely pleasant outcome if you were a cook in Antwerp. The Arab merchants who had carried those spices for generations found their livelihoods threatened by armed competition, which is a considerably less pleasant outcome if you are a trader in Aden. The Portuguese crown grew rich enough to fund one of the most extraordinary bursts of artistic and architectural patronage in European history. The communities along the Malabar coast who had grown the spices and traded them peacefully for centuries found themselves caught between a Portuguese naval power that demanded compliance and local rulers who demanded resistance. These contradictions were not unique to the Portuguese. They were the contradictions of the entire age of European oceanic expansion, and they did not resolve themselves cleanly. They accumulated, deepened, and eventually produced the colonial systems that would dominate global politics for the next several centuries. Da Gama's voyage was not the cause of all of that, but it was the first chapter, and first chapters matter because they establish the logic that the chapters following them tend to repeat. There is one more thing worth noting before we move on. The Indian Ocean itself didn't change. The monsoon winds still shifted on the same schedule they always had. The flying fish still leapt from the same blue water. The stars that had guided Arab and Indian navigators for centuries still rose and set in the same positions. The ocean that da Gama crossed in 1498 was the same ocean that Ibn Battuta had crossed in the 14th century. The same ocean that Arab dhows had sailed for 1,000 years before that. What changed was who claimed authority over it, and that claim was made not by the ocean's oldest navigators, but by men who had arrived in it for the first time only a few years earlier, carrying guns and letters from a king in Lisbon who had decided with remarkable confidence that the sea route to India belonged to Portugal. That confidence and the force used to back it up is what transformed da Gama's voyage from a remarkable feat of navigation into a hinge point in world history. And the man at the centre of it, the one who had actually sailed the route, who had stood on the deck of the San Gabriel as it rounded the Cape and crossed the Indian Ocean and anchored off Calicut, was still alive as all of this unfolded, watching the world he had opened continue to expand in directions that would outlast him by centuries. His own story, though, was not quite finished yet. Vasco da Gama lived for another 25 years after his first voyage returned him to Lisbon. That is a long time to be the man who opened the sea route to India, and he spent those years in a complicated position, celebrated by the crown, rewarded with titles and income, but not always employed in the way his reputation might have suggested. He had a second voyage, which we have already followed, and then a period of relative quietness, at least by the standards of the age. He married a woman named Catarina de Ataide, had 6 sons, and settled into the kind of life that a man of his status and achievement might reasonably expect. He was given the title Count of Vidigueira in 1519, which made him a nobleman of considerable standing. He had a coat of arms, land, and the respect that came with being the person who had done the thing that Portugal had spent decades trying to do. But da Gama was not a man who seems to have been content with simply being remembered. He was ambitious and difficult in ways that made even his admirers keep a careful distance. His temperament had always been more suited to command than to diplomacy, more comfortable with authority than with negotiation. He was the kind of person who got things done, often at a cost that he himself did not always acknowledge. By the early 1520s, Portugal's Estado da India, the network of trading posts, fortresses and naval stations that now stretch from East Africa to the Malabar coast and beyond, was in trouble. Not collapsing, but struggling. Corruption had settled into the administration the way it tends to settle into any distant colonial enterprise when the people running it are far from home and accountable to no one nearby. Local governors were enriching themselves, trade agreements were being ignored, the Portuguese presence in India was generating wealth, but not as efficiently as the Crown wanted, and the discipline that had made the early years of the enterprise so brutally effective had frayed. King John III, who had come to the throne in 1521, decided that what was needed was someone with unquestioned authority and an uncompromising reputation. Someone the governors and traders and soldiers would actually listen to. He chose da Gama. In 1524, Vasco da Gama was appointed Viceroy of India. He was somewhere in his 60s by then, the exact year of his birth still uncertain, though most historians place it around 1460 or perhaps a few years later. He was old for the standards of the age, and the voyage itself was not easy. He left Portugal in April of 1524, commanding a fleet of 14 ships, and the crossing was difficult. Several ships were damaged in storms. Da Gama himself was reportedly unwell for parts of the journey. But he arrived in Goa in September of 1524, and by all accounts he immediately set about doing what he had been sent to do. He did not ease into the role. He confronted corrupt officials directly, dismissed people who had been abusing their positions, and attempted to reimpose the kind of strict order that the Estado da India had supposedly been built on. Some of the people he removed had powerful friends back in Lisbon, which created problems. Others were simply startled by his manner, which had apparently not softened with age. He was still the same man who had burned the Miri, who had held hostages in Calicut, who had bombarded coastal towns from the deck of a warship. Authority for da Gama was not something to be suggested, it was something to be demonstrated. But his time as viceroy was brief. He had been in India for only a few months when his health declined sharply. He moved from Goa to Cochin, the city on the Malabar coast now known as Kochi, which was another important centre of Portuguese activity in India. He died there on December the 24th, 1524, Christmas Eve. He had spent the last months of his life trying to reorganise an empire that had grown out of the voyage he'd made 26 years earlier, and he died in the very part of the world that voyage had been designed to reach. He was buried initially in Cochin, in the church of Santo Antonio. His body remained in India for 14 years before being returned to Portugal in 1538. And where he was eventually buried is, in its own quiet way, one of the more resonant details of his entire story. He was laid to rest at the Jerónimos Monastery in Lisbon, the same monastery that had been built partly to celebrate the success of his first voyage. The construction of the Jerónimos had been funded largely with the wealth that flowed in after 1499, after the cargo of pepper and cinnamon and cloves had been sold, and the world had understood what the sea route to India actually meant in commercial terms. The monastery is a remarkable building even today. Its stone carvings are extraordinarily detailed, full of maritime imagery, ropes, armillary spheres, coral, anchors, as if the building itself is trying to remember where the money came from. Da Gama's tomb is there, in the church, carved from stone, resting in a space that his voyage helped to pay for. There is something quietly circular about that, though whether it is poetic or merely ironic probably depends on your view of the man. His reputation has shifted considerably over the centuries. In Portugal, da Gama was celebrated for a very long time as a national hero of the First Order. The poet Luís de Camões wrote an epic poem called Os Lusíadas, published in 1572, which used da Gama's voyage as its central narrative and cast the Portuguese explorers as figures of almost mythological significance, guided by the gods of antiquity and destined for greatness. It is considered one of the great works of Portuguese literature, and it shaped how the voyage was remembered and retold for generations. Da Gama, in that tradition, was not just a navigator. He was a symbol of Portuguese ambition, courage, and destiny. A figure who had done something genuinely extraordinary and whose achievement deserved to be celebrated in the highest possible terms. That version of the story was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete in ways that took a long time to acknowledge. The courage was real, the navigational achievement was real, the endurance required to sail those ships around Africa and across the Indian Ocean and back again, losing more than 2/3 of his crew on the first voyage alone, was genuine and considerable. These things do not become less true because of what followed, but what followed was also real, and the people on the receiving end of Portuguese naval expansion did not generally experience it as an epic poem. Historians today tend to hold both parts of the story with more care than earlier accounts did. The voyage of 1497 to 1499 is still recognised as one of the most significant feats of navigation in human history, a genuine turning point that connected oceanic trade systems in ways that had never existed before, and that reshaped the global economy over the following century. And the same voyage is also recognised as the opening act of a European imperial presence in the Indian Ocean that brought with it violence, disruption, and the systematic subordination of existing trade communities to European commercial and military power. These two assessments are not in competition. They describe the same event from different vantage points, and a complete account of the voyage has to include both. What is perhaps most striking, when you stand back and look at the full shape of Da Gama's life, is how much of it was determined by a single decision made in Lisbon in 1497. The decision to send those 4 ships with that particular man in command on that particular route. Everything that followed, the wealth, the titles, the violence, the empire, the monastery, the tomb, the poem, grew out of that departure from the port of Restilo on July 8th, 1497. A date that most people in Europe at the time would not have known about, and that most of the world had no reason to mark. 4 ships leaving a harbour on the edge of the Atlantic. Nothing about the moment itself announced what it would mean. And the Indian Ocean, of course, did not notice. The monsoon winds shifted as they always had. The flying fish moved through the same blue water. The stars rose and set in the patterns that Arab and Indian navigators had memorized over centuries of careful observation. The ocean that Da Gama crossed was ancient and indifferent, and it had been carrying ships long before any Portuguese sailor had ever stood on its shores. It would continue to carry ships long after the Estado de India had dissolved, and the empire that built it had faded from its former power. The ocean outlasts everything. That is one of the things that makes it such a persistent image in the imagination, the sense that it was there before us, and will be thereafter, moving in its own slow rhythms, indifferent to the names we give the ships that cross it, or the claims we make about who owns its routes. But the world on the shores of that ocean was changed, and changed permanently, by what Da Gama's voyage set in motion. Calicut, where he had anchored in May of 1498, was bombarded by Cabral's fleet in 1500, and bombarded again by Da Gama's own guns in 1502. The Arab merchants who had traded peacefully in those ports for generations found themselves navigating a new and dangerous reality in which European warships claimed authority over sea routes that had never belonged to any single power before. The Swahili city-states of the East African coast, so prosperous and cosmopolitan when the Portuguese first encountered them, were gradually brought under Portuguese control or destroyed when they resisted. Mombasa was sacked multiple times. Kilwa was occupied. The sophisticated trading world that had existed along that coast for centuries was disrupted in ways from which it took generations to recover. None of this was the intention of the man who left Lisbon in 1497 with 4 ships and a set of stone pillars to plant along the African coast. Da Gama was not thinking about empire in the broad sense. He was thinking about the route, about the spices, about the trade agreement he was supposed to negotiate, about getting his ships and his crew back to Portugal. He was a practical man on a practical mission. The empire came later, built by others using the road he had opened, expanded far beyond anything the first voyage had demonstrated was possible. But the road was his, and the logic of what followed was already present in the way the voyage was conducted. The willingness to use force, the assumption of authority over waters that did not belong to Portugal, the treatment of foreign rulers as obstacles to be managed rather than as equals to be respected. That logic did not emerge from nowhere. It was there in the first voyage, and it was carried forward into everything that came after. Da Gama himself lived long enough to see the empire he had helped to create grow into something large and complicated, and increasingly difficult to manage. He died trying to fix it, in a city that had not existed as a Portuguese possession when he was born, on a coast he had first reached by doing something no European sailor had done before. There is a kind of completeness to that, even if the word completeness does not quite capture the weight of everything that surrounds it. The Jerónimos monastery still stands in Lisbon near the waterfront in the district of Belém. The stone carvings are still there. The tomb is still there. Tourists visit it every year, many of them without knowing whose bones lie inside or what story the building was built to celebrate. The Tagus River runs past it, wide and slow, moving toward the Atlantic the way it always has. On a quiet evening, when the light is low and the water is dark, it is not difficult to imagine what it might have felt like to stand there in 1497, watching 4 wooden ships move away from the shore and grow smaller against the horizon. The people who watched that departure did not know what they were watching. They knew it was a great undertaking. They knew men might not come back, but they could not have known that those 4 ships were about to change the shape of the world in ways that would take centuries to fully understand. The ships are gone now. The men are gone. The empire they helped to build is gone, or at least transformed beyond recognition. But the route is still there, and the ocean is still there, and the monsoon winds still move in the same directions at the same times of year, as reliable now as they were when an Arab pilot stood on the deck of a Portuguese ship in April of 1498 and guided it across 2,000 miles of open water toward a coast that the crew had never seen. Some things change everything. Some things change nothing. The voyage of Vasco da Gama was both of those at once, and perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about it. Wherever you are tonight, whether it is late or early, warm or cold, near the sea or far from it, I hope this journey has been a good companion for a few quiet hours. The story of those 4 ships and the man who commanded them is one of the genuinely strange and significant stories of human history, full of courage and cruelty, vision and violence, extraordinary endurance and extraordinary harm. It does not resolve into a simple lesson, and it should not. The world it opened was too large and too complicated for simple lessons, but it is worth knowing, worth sitting with, worth following from the harbour in Lisbon all the way to a tomb in a monastery by the river and back again to the open water where it all began. Sleep well, and thank you for spending this time here.